John Deere. Nothing runs like a deer, except a farm cat, being chased by a sentient tractor and other tales of mechanical malice, fall asleep to hilarious history, in the narrative style of Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1. The Stubborn Soil of Illinois. To look upon the Illinois prairie in those early unvarnished days was to look upon a vast verdant deception. It was a sea of grass that stretched toward the horizon with the promise of infinite bounty, a landscape so flat it seemed the Creator had simply leveled it with a giant's trowel and grown tired before he could add any mountains or valleys to break the monotony. The immigrant, fresh off the boat and weary of the crowded cobblestones of the East, would plant his boots into this dark, rich earth and feel a surge of optimism that can only be described as a temporary lapse of judgment. He would look at the soil, black as a raven's wing and promising enough to make a stone sprout, and think, "Here I shall build my kingdom." And then he would try to plow it. Ah, the plow! That noble instrument of civilization designed to turn the earth and invite the sun to kiss the hidden minerals beneath. In the rocky fields of New England, the plow was a familiar friend, albeit a cantankerous one. It struck stone, it skipped, it jumped, but it performed its duty. But here, in the heart of the prairie, the soil did not want to be turned. It had spent an eternity binding itself together with the tangled, muscular roots of prairie grass, creating a subterranean web of defiance that would make a sailor's knot look like a child's plaything. When a man hitched his team to a traditional wood and cast-iron plow and struck the earth, he was not merely farming. He was engaging in a slow-motion wrestling match with a continent. The ground was not dirt, as we understand the term in civilized circles. It was a glue of biblical proportions, a tenacious, adhesive sludge that clung to the iron mold board with the desperate affection of a long-lost relative. After a few yards, the plow would stop, choked by a mountainous gob of gumbo that refused to slide. The farmer would wipe the sweat from his brow, curse the day he traded his sensible city shoes for these mud-caked boots, and take a spade to the blade to scrape it clean. He would take 2 more steps, and the process would repeat. It was a dance of frustration, performed in the blistering sun, accompanied by the rhythmic swearing of men who had come west to find paradise, and discovered instead that they had wandered into an industrial strength, sticky trap. It was said, though I suspect the local storytellers added a dash of vinegar to the tale, that a man could lose his boots in that mud and never see them again, the soil having swallowed them whole as a modest appetizer. To farm this land was to participate in a comedy of exhaustion. One spent more time cleaning the plow than pulling it. The horses grew lean and miserable, their heads hung low, wondering perhaps if they had offended a higher power in a previous life to be tethered to such a futile endeavor. The prairie, you see, had a grudge. It had been left undisturbed for millennia, and it resented these newcomers with their tiny machines and their grand ambitions. It held onto its moisture with a stubbornness that defied the laws of physics, turning into a slurry that could stop a steam engine and break a man's spirit before the midday meal. The pioneers, those hardy souls who usually greeted hardship with a grin and a song, found that their repertoire of humor was severely limited when faced with an acre that refused to be tilled. It was a curious stalemate. On one side stood the pioneer, armed with the best technology of the 18th century and a stubborn streak that could rival a Missouri mule. On the other side sat the prairie, vast, silent, and imperturbably sticky. The plow was meant to be the instrument of progress, the spearhead of westward expansion. But here it was nothing more than a glorified anchor, dragging through the mud and acting as a monument to human folly. One might have looked at the situation and concluded that the region was simply meant to be left to the bison and the wildflowers. But man, in his infinite and often misguided wisdom, does not like to be told no by a patch of dirt. He will go to his grave believing he can negotiate with the elements if he only has the right piece of iron. And so he kept plowing, he kept scraping, and he kept dreaming of a blade that might, by some miracle of metallurgy, slip through that black, stubborn muck like a hot knife through a cold pat of butter. He did not yet know that the solution was not to be found in prayer, but in a discarded saw blade and the sheer beautiful vanity of a polished edge. But that, as they say, is a story for the next chapter, and I should hate to ruin the suspense by suggesting that a little bit of shine can conquer a kingdom. Chapter 2. The Blacksmith's Lightbulb. Now, it is a well-established truth in the annals of human progress that the most profound shifts in our destiny rarely arrive with the fanfare of a brass band or the formal announcement of a committee. No, they usually sidle up to a man while he is minding his own business, perhaps while he is knee-deep in the mundane frustrations of his trade, looking for a way to stop his own swearing. Take Mr. John Deere, for instance. He was a man of iron and anvil, a blacksmith of Grand Detour, Illinois, who spent his days wrestling with the broken tools of a frontier that was perpetually snapping, bending, or simply giving up the ghost. His shop was a sanctuary of sparks and soot, a place where the local farmers would congregate to complain about the weather, the crop prices, and, most incessantly, the stubbornness of the prairie soil that we discussed in our last installment. They would stand there, these farmers, leaning against the doorframe, their boots still heavy with the black, clinging gumbo that refused to be shaken off, and they would recount their miseries. "John," they would say, with the hollowed-out eyes of men who had spent their morning scraping their plows with a hand-held shovel, "it is a cruel joke. We have the best land in the hemisphere, and yet we cannot turn a single acre without performing a 2-hour dance with a spade. My horses are exhausted, my plow is a dull, mud-caked disappointment, and my patience is thinner than a politician's promise." John Deere listened, as a good blacksmith should, but his mind was not merely on the mending of horseshoes or the sharpening of axes. He was a man who possessed that rare and dangerous commodity known as curiosity. He didn't just hear the complaints, he felt the weight of them. He began to wonder why a plow, which worked perfectly fine in the lighter, sandy soils of the East, became a useless lump of wood and iron the moment it tasted the rich, dark nutrients of the Illinois plains. He pondered the chemistry of the thing, though he wouldn't have called it chemistry. He saw it as a battle between the steel and the muck. The problem, as he observed it, was one of friction, that invisible, sticky, and utterly infuriating force that kept the soil firmly attached to the mold board. The standard cast-iron plow, you see, was rough. It was porous. It was a textured surface upon which the prairie mud could find purchase, dig its heels in, and refuse to budge. It was during one of these brooding sessions, perhaps while staring at a pile of scrap iron that had seen better days, that he found his muse. It was a discarded steel saw blade. It was not a grand, shimmering piece of industrial perfection. It was a jagged, used-up remnant of someone else's labor. But to the eye of a man like Deere, it held a secret. He ran his hand over the surface of the steel. It was smooth, it was hard, and it lacked the grainy, porous nature of the cast-iron tools that were failing every farmer in the county. He held the blade up to the light of his forge. The light caught the polish, dancing along the edge, and for a moment the smithy felt a quiet, crackling realization. It was like a light bulb going off, though we didn't have light bulbs in those days. So let us say it was like a sudden bolt of lightning inspiration that strikes a man when he is least expecting to be profound. He realized that the secret was not in the strength of the plow, for the cast-iron ones was strong enough to break a man's back, but in the finish. The earth, in all its sticky, stubborn majesty, was a snob. It demanded a surface that was polished to a mirror-like perfection, a surface so slick that the mud would have no choice but to slide off it, defeated by its own lack of traction. He didn't run out into the street shouting, "Eureka!" for that is the sort of thing people do in books, but rarely in real life. Instead, he went to work with the quiet intensity of a man who has decided to rewrite the laws of agriculture. He began to shape that steel, cutting it, hammering it, and polishing it until his arms ached, and the air in the shop was thick with the scent of hot metal and honest toil. He worked with a singular focus, ignoring the chatter of the farmers and the tolling of the clock, driven by the thought of a plow that would glide through the prairie grass like a phantom, leaving a perfectly turned furrow in its wake. There is a peculiar kind of solitude in the work of an inventor. He stands on the edge of the known world, looking into the fog of the what-if. And he must have the stubbornness of a mule to keep going when everyone else tells him that the world is built the way it is for a reason. His neighbors likely watched him with that mixture of pity and amusement that small-town folks reserve for a man who is clearly up to no good, or worse yet, up to something that won't make a dime. "John's messing about with old saws again," they'd say, shaking their heads as they passed the shop. "Poor fellow, the heat in that forge has finally cooked his brain." But John Deere didn't care. He was engaged in the high art of the scour, a term that would eventually become the holy word of the tillage world. He understood that if he could get that steel to scour clean, to shed the dirt as it cut, he would not just be building a plow. He would be unlocking the potential of an entire continent. He would be turning the wild, unruly wilderness into a breadbasket that would eventually feed the world and, more importantly, stop the local farmers from complaining about their boots in his shop. It was an act of quiet, technological rebellion. The establishment at the time believed that the weight of the plow was what mattered, that you needed mass to cut the thick prairie sod. But John Deere realized that the mass was the enemy. He wanted a blade that worked with the earth, not against it. He wanted a tool that respected the friction and used it to its own advantage. As he shaped the curves of that moldboard, he was doing more than smithing. He was composing a poem in steel. He was drafting the first chapter of a new era, though he wouldn't have thought of it in such grand terms. He was simply trying to find a way to make the plow do what the salesman promised it would, but which it had steadfastly refused to do since the first wagon train rolled across the Mississippi. He was a man standing in a small, dusty corner of the Illinois frontier, wielding a hammer and a dream, about to prove that the most complex problems in this world, the ones that keep a man awake at night and make him wonder why he ever left the city, often have the simplest solutions, provided one is brave enough to look at a piece of scrap metal and see not garbage, but the future. The prairie was still there, vast and waiting, and it was still holding its grudge. But for the first time, it was about to meet a piece of iron that didn't care for its attitude. The revolution had begun not with a roar, but with the subtle, sliding sound of steel meeting dirt, and the world was about to change in a way that would make the prairie turn, if not quite polite, at least a great deal more productive. Chapter 3. The Invention of the Scour. There exists in the moral and mechanical history of mankind a singular golden moment, usually arriving about 3 seconds after a man has entirely given up hope, when the universe decides to stop playing the trickster and coughs up the answer. For the pioneer, the answer was not found in a dusty tome of philosophy or a lecture from a traveling preacher. It was found in the glorious, slippery, and absolutely undeniable mechanics of the scour. To the uninitiated, the term might sound like something one does to a dirty skillet, or perhaps the act of a particularly grumpy schoolmarm dealing with a misbehaving pupil. But in the lexicon of the prairie, the scour was nothing less than the Holy Grail. It was the moment when the soil, which had previously clung to the iron with the desperate suffocating attachment of a barnacle to a ship's hull, suddenly realized it had lost its grip. It was a divorce of the most efficient kind, presided over by the polished, unyielding arrogance of Mr. Deere's new-fangled steel. John Deere's shop, as we have noted, was less of a place of business and more of a laboratory of desperation. When he finally hauled his prototype out of the forge, a contraption that looked for all the world like a man-made fin intended for a giant river fish, the local crowd had gathered mostly out of a morbid curiosity to see what sort of disaster would unfold. They expected, as is the habit of the cynical, to see the plow bogged down within the first 10 feet. They expected the familiar sight of John stopping, sighing, and reaching for that ever-present spade to perform the ritual scraping of the blade. It was a familiar liturgy of failure, and they were quite prepared to participate in the choir of "I told you so." John, however, did not look like a man who expected to fail. He looked like a man who had seen the inner workings of the earth and had been granted a private, whispered revelation. He hitched his team, a pair of oxen who were, by all accounts, as unimpressed with the state of agriculture as their masters, and drove toward the field. The soil, that thick black adhesive menace, was waiting. It was in a particularly foul mood, having been rained upon the night before, rendering it a consistency not unlike a very ambitious molasses. The bystanders watched. The oxen leaned into the yoke. The plow hit the dirt. And then the impossible occurred. It did not stop. It did not shudder. It did not stutter in the wake of the thick, fibrous roots that had defeated every other man in the county. It simply went. It cut a clean, crisp, beautiful curl of earth, lifting it from the depths and turning it over with the grace of a debutante performing a waltz. The soil, seemingly shocked by its own lack of purchase, slid off the polished steel moldboard and tumbled into the furrow, defeated, broken, and, most importantly, absent. The plow kept moving. John did not stop to scrape. He did not reach for the spade. He did not curse. He simply kept walking, a faint, infuriatingly calm smile playing on his lips, while behind him the earth lay exposed in a perfect, continuous ribbon of dark gold. The crowd stood in a silence so profound it would have shamed a cathedral. They looked at the field, they looked at the plow, and then they looked at one another with the dawning, terrifying realization that the world had just tipped on its axis. What they had witnessed was the birth of the scour. You see, the secret was not in the force applied by the oxen, but in the vanity of the metal. By polishing that steel blade to a mirror sheen, John had denied the soil the very thing it required to be difficult, a place to grab hold. The earth is, at its heart, a creature of habit. It likes to stick to things. It likes to cling to the rough, the porous, and the stubborn. But when confronted with a surface so smooth that light danced upon it like a hummingbird on a summer breeze, the soil found itself utterly incapable of forming a bond. It was as if the plow had donned an invisible, impenetrable armor of slippery indifference. It was a lesson that the industrial world would take decades to fully digest. If you cannot overcome a problem with brute force, you must overcome it with elegance. The farmers, naturally, were slow to accept this. They were men of deep-seated superstitions, and they viewed this new sliding plow with the suspicion one might reserve for a man who claims he can walk on water. They poked at the blade, they squinted at the polish, and they muttered about witchcraft and hollow promises. They were convinced that surely, by the second or third field, the mud would regain its courage and reclaim its territory. But it did not. The scour was absolute. It was a conquest of physics by sheer, stubborn, blacksmith-wrought ingenuity. John Deere, for his part, did not rush to write a manifesto or declare himself the emperor of the furrow. He simply stood by his anvil, wiped the soot from his hands, and waited for the next man to come knocking. He knew that the news would travel. Stories on the frontier have a way of moving faster than a prairie fire in a drought, and this was the kind of story that would be whispered in every barn, every general store, and every kitchen table from here to the Mississippi. He had turned the prairie's grudge into an invitation. He had made the earth work for the man, rather than forcing the man to beg the earth for a living, and in doing so, he had done something far more dangerous than just inventing a tool. He had set a precedent. He had shown the world that there is no obstacle, no matter how sticky, how deep, or how stubborn, that cannot be defeated if one only takes the time to polish one's blade. The era of the 2-hour scrap was over. The era of the continuous turn had arrived, and with it, the quiet, humming realization that the American farmer was no longer a servant of the soil, but its master. Of course, the farmer would continue to complain about the weather, about the taxes, and about the rising cost of twine, for that is a human necessity as vital as breathing. But he would do it from the seat of a plow that actually worked, and that, in the grand, whimsical comedy of human progress, is a victory of the highest order. And so the legend of the scour took root. It was not a violent revolution, nor was it a loud one. It was a quiet, sliding, graceful thing, much like the plow itself. It was the sound of a century turning over, the sound of a future being carved into the land, and the sound of a man in a small Illinois shop finally getting a good night's sleep, knowing that when he went back to the forge tomorrow, he would have nothing to fix but his own imagination. The prairie was still vast. It was still formidable. But the man with the polished steel had shown that even the most stubborn, adhesive, and begrudging landscape in the universe has a soft spot, if you only know where to polish it. It is a lesson that serves well in farming, in engineering, and, if I may be so bold, in the delicate business of living one's life. Always keep your blade polished, my friends, for you never know when you might come across a patch of mud that thinks it's entitled to stop you. Chapter 4. The March of the Green and Yellow. It is a curious and melancholy fact of the human condition that we possess a desperate, gnawing need to color our tools as if we were painting the very face of God. A man might own a horse, and he does not care if the beast is dappled, chestnut, or the color of a rainy Tuesday, so long as it pulls the buggy. But give that same man a machine, a contraption of gears, levers, and stubborn, self-important iron, and he suddenly develops the aesthetic sensibilities of an eccentric painter in the Latin Quarter. He must have his machine distinct. He must have it visible from the next county over. He must have it bright enough to cause a mild squint in a passing eagle. And thus we arrive at the color scheme of John Deere's descendants, that peculiar, aggressive, and utterly impossible combination of green and yellow. One might wonder, in a quiet moment of reflection, why a company tasked with the serious, soul-crushing business of subduing the prairie would choose a palette that seems better suited for a tropical parrot with a penchant for showing off. The world of the 19th century was a drab affair. It was painted in the muted, apologetic tones of soot, raw timber, and the mud that we have already established was the primary resident of the Illinois plains. If you looked across a field in 1845, the scenery was about as vibrant as a bucket of dishwater. The farmers wore wool of a shade best described as bovine disappointment, and the sky, when it wasn't gray, was merely a lighter, more polite shade of gray. But the green and yellow? My stars, that was an intervention. There are those who claim, with the dry, humorless precision of an accountant, that these colors were chosen for reasons of marketing or psychology. They speak of visibility and brand recognition, as if the early settlers were concerned about their trademark being pilfered by a rival blacksmith in the next valley. But I suspect the truth is far more whimsical and perhaps a bit more wicked. The color was chosen, I submit, because the prairie is a deceptive, bottomless, and utterly unforgiving void. It is a place where a man can set down a tool for 1 minute to wipe his brow, and when he turns back, the earth has conspired to swallow it whole. The prairie grass, that tall, tangled, yellow-brown menace, is the perfect camouflage for anything that isn't actively trying to stand out. A plow left in a field might as well be a ship lost in the Sargasso Sea. It simply vanishes into the brown, grassy ether, never to be seen by human eyes again, unless it is found a century later by some future plowman who will curse his luck for hitting a rusted hunk of iron. John Deere's successors, or at least the men who took up the mantle once the blacksmith shop began to grow into something that resembled an empire, realized that if you want to sell a machine to a man who is prone to losing things, you must paint it in colors that are, quite frankly, offensive to the natural order. Green, the color of the very crops he was meant to harvest, and yellow, the color of the sun that baked him, a marriage of hues that could not possibly be ignored, even by the most thick-headed or distracted farmer. If a John Deere machine was lost in a field, it would have to be because the farmer was blind, or perhaps because the prairie had finally decided to stage a protest against such garish, unnatural brightness. It was a tactical, psychological barrier against the encroaching wilderness. It said, "Here I am, you vast, brown, boring landscape. I am green, I am yellow, and I am not going anywhere." There is a profound vanity in this. It is the vanity of man saying to nature, "I shall impose my will upon you, and I shall do it in a color that hurts your eyes." I have spent many an hour contemplating these machines parked like gargantuan, neon-bright sleeping beasts at the edge of the woods. They do not blend in. They do not harmonize with the rolling hills or the quiet majesty of the oak trees. They sit there with an air of immense mechanical confidence, looking for all the world like they had been dropped from a passing circus train that had taken a wrong turn at the Mississippi. And yet, there is something entirely appropriate about it. Farming is not a quiet, meditative retreat into the bosom of nature. It is a violent, noisy, and highly competitive struggle for calories. If one is going to engage in the business of tearing up the crust of the earth, one might as well do it with a bit of flourish. If you are going to be covered in sweat and manure, your machine should at least have the decency to look like it belongs on a parade float. The locals in Moline, in those early days of expansion, must have looked at the first green and yellow tractors with a mixture of awe and bewilderment. They were accustomed to the iron black of the forge, the wood brown of the wagon, and the gray white of the winter sky. To see a machine roll out of the factory looking like a giant overfed grasshopper was to witness a change in the very fabric of society. It was the birth of the brand, that modern deity which demands our loyalty, our admiration, and, quite frequently, a significant portion of our life savings. But let us not be too hard on the color. It serves a purpose beyond the merely practical. It is a signal in the dark. It is a beacon of reliability, or at least a beacon of expense, which in the mind of the farmer are often the same thing. When a man sees that specific shade of green, not a forest green nor a lime green, but a green that seems to have been mixed with the essence of pure, unadulterated profit, he knows, or at least he hopes, that he is looking at a machine that will not leave him stranded in the middle of a 40-acre patch of mud. It is a marketing genius that borders on the divine. By choosing colors that are impossible to hide, the company ensured that every farm, every dealer lot, and every parade in the Midwest became a living billboard. It is said that in some parts a man can identify a John Deere tractor from 3 miles away on a foggy morning just by the way the yellow wheels seem to vibrate against the backdrop of the gray clouds. It is a cultural fingerprint. It is a badge of belonging. One might think that such a bold display would invite the mockery of one's neighbors, but it is quite the opposite. To possess a piece of machinery that is so vividly, aggressively green and yellow is a sign of status. It is a way of saying, I have conquered the prairie, and I have done so with a machine that looks like it cost more than my house. It is the triumph of the artificial over the natural, the victory of the factory over the field. And frankly, is that not the entire point of agriculture? We do not farm to keep the wilderness wild. We farm to make it behave, and if a bit of bright neon paint helps us keep track of where we've been and where we're going, then so be it. The march of the green and yellow was not merely a change in the factory's paint booth. It was the beginning of a transformation in the American soul. It was the moment we decided that our machines were not just tools, but extensions of our own personality, at least the personality we wish to project to the rest of the county. It was the moment we traded the quiet, modest browns of the pioneer for the loud, confident, and impossible colors of the industrial titan. And if, from time to time, one finds that the green of the tractor matches the green of the weeds he is trying to kill, well, that is simply the irony of the universe having a bit of fun at our expense. The prairie still holds its grudge, of course, but it has learned a lesson. It may be brown, it may be sticky, and it may be endless, but it will never, ever be as loud as a brand new, polished to perfection, neon bright harvester. The color is the victory, the paint is the promise, and the farmer, sitting atop his green and yellow throne, is the king of all he surveys, or, at the very least, he is the most visible thing for 20 miles in any direction. Chapter 5. The Salesman's Tall Tale. Now, there is a fine, thin, and often invisible line between a mechanical truth and a fishing story, and nowhere was that line more frequently stepped over than in the early days of the agricultural implement trade. Once the plow had been perfected, once the steel had been polished to that vanity-mirrored shine we have discussed, the problem shifted from the difficulty of the work to the difficulty of the sell. You see, it is one thing to build a tool that will not stick to the mud. It is quite another to convince a man whose father and grandfather were defeated by that same mud that he should part with his hard-earned cash for a piece of metal that looks, to his skeptical eye, far too pretty to be useful. Enter the traveling salesman. He was a creature of a different breed, a man who possessed a tongue as smooth as the moldboard he sold, and a suit that was, in most cases, a few years behind the fashion of the East, but light years ahead of the local barn dance. He arrived in town with a catalogue of miracles and a suitcase full of promises, and he spoke with the confidence of a man who had never seen a field he couldn't conquer. The salesman knew that the prairie farmer was a man of deep, abiding cynicism. He had learned the hard way that the universe is a place where droughts, grasshoppers, and crop failures are the only things you can rely on with any consistency. To tell such a man that his life was about to be transformed by a John Deere plow was a task requiring the rhetorical gifts of a revival preacher and the nerves of a riverboat gambler. "My good man," the salesman would say, leaning against the fence and gesturing toward the horizon with a flourish, "you are looking at a machine that will not only plow your fields, it will restore your faith in the very concept of gravity. This is not mere iron. This is a surgical instrument. It will slip through that soil like a ghost, through a keyhole. It will leave behind a furrow so straight and so clean that even the local schoolmaster could use it to teach geometry." The farmer would spit, adjust his hat, and stare at the plow as if it were a particularly suspicious-looking toad. "I've heard that before," he'd mutter. "I've heard it from the fellow with the cast-iron contraption, and I've heard it from the man with the wooden frame. They all promise the moon, and they all end up in the mud." "Ah," the salesman would counter, his eyes twinkling with the sincerity of a man selling snake oil to a man with a headache, "but you have not seen the Scour. This is the steel that remembers what it was like to be a saw, and it has not forgotten how to bite. Do you see this sheen? Do you see how it captures the light of the sun? That, my friend, is not just polish. That is the finish of the future. It is the end of the scrape. It is the beginning of the end for the prairie's grudge." And then the storytelling would begin. It was a fine art, this mix of mechanical fact and the kind of aggressive, hyperbolic imagination usually reserved for the fish that got away. The salesman would tell tales of farmers in the next county over, farmers who, by his account, had been on the brink of financial ruin, forced to feed their children on turnip greens and hope, who had been saved practically overnight by the introduction of the Deere steel. He spoke of men who had finished their plowing by noon, leaving them with so much free time they had taken up poetry or moved to the city to run for office. He told of oxen that had grown fat and lazy, so accustomed were they to the ease of the pull. He told of fields that had produced corn so tall it had to be harvested with a ladder, all because the soil had been properly aerated by the magic of the mold board. He painted a picture of the agricultural life so idyllic, so profitable, and so effortless that it sounded less like a description of farming and more like a fever dream of the Garden of Eden. The beauty of these tales was not in their accuracy, for accuracy is a dull, dusty thing that has no place in the world of high-stakes commerce. The beauty was in the possibility. The salesman was not selling a plow. He was selling a dream of an easier life. He was selling the idea that, against all odds, the man on the prairie could be the master of his domain. And if, in the process, he had to exaggerate the durability of the steel or downplay the amount of maintenance required, well, that was simply the tax one paid for the privilege of hearing a good story. The farmers, for all their skepticism, were as vulnerable to a good, tall tale as anyone else. They lived isolated, difficult lives, and the arrival of a man who could spin a yarn about machines that could move mountains, or at least move mud, was a welcome distraction. They would gather at the general store, the blacksmith shop, or the edge of the field, and they would listen, captivated, as the salesman spun his web of words. "I tell you," the salesman would proclaim, his voice rising to the rafters, "the day is coming when the man behind the plow will be the most envied soul in the territory. The machines will do the labor, the steel will do the work, and the farmer will sit back in his rocking chair and watch the wealth roll in like a river in spring flood." They would laugh, of course. They knew the reality. They knew that no matter how good the plow was, the sun would still be hot, the work would still be hard, and the soil would still be, at its heart, a fickle and demanding mistress. But they bought the plows anyway. They bought them because, in that moment, the salesman's story was a better reality than their own. They bought them because they wanted to believe that somewhere, in the heart of that iron, there was a secret that would make their struggles mean something. It was a brilliant cycle. The salesman told the story. The farmer bought the plow. The plow actually worked well enough to keep the farmer from throwing it in the river, and the farmer then went out and told his own slightly embellished version of the story to his neighbor. And so the reputation of the steel grew, a mix of mechanical fact, a touch of engineering genius, and the kind of aggressive storytelling that has fueled the American expansion since the first ship landed on the coast. It is a curious thing, is it not, that a nation built on the serious, bone-wearying work of clearing land and tilling dirt should have its mechanical history written in the language of the tall tale. But that is the American way. We do not just build our machines, we mythologize them. We turn our tractors into legends, our plows into folk heroes, and our salesmen into the bards of the forge. As for the salesman, he would pack his suitcase, tip his hat, and ride off into the sunset, leaving behind a field that was just a little bit easier to manage, and a farmer who was just a little bit more convinced of his own importance. He was a pioneer in his own right, a man who mapped the frontiers of the human imagination and found that, with enough polish and a good enough story, even the most stubborn prairie could be made to sing. He did not leave behind a wake of broken dreams or empty promises, but a trail of turned earth that stretched like a long winding sentence across the pages of the American story. A story that I suspect is still being told, one polished furrow at a time. Chapter 6. The Moline Miracle. If you take a map of the United States and lay it out on a kitchen table, the kind of sturdy oak table that has survived 3 generations of spilled gravy and heated arguments, and you put your finger right there on the Mississippi River, you will find Moline. In the grand geography of the world, Moline might seem like a mere speck, a quiet river town doing its best to stay above the waterline. But in the secret, subterranean history of human ambition, Moline was the navel of the universe. It was the place where the river met the iron, where the current of progress collided with the stubbornness of the prairie, and where a small blacksmith shop decided, quite suddenly and without consulting anyone, that it was destined to become a fortress of industry. It is a funny thing about industrial centers. They never start with the intent of becoming empires. They start with a leaky roof, a stack of coal that's running low, and a blacksmith who is tired of being asked to fix the same busted wagon wheel for the 4th time in a month. They begin as humble, soot-stained affairs, smelling of sulfur and honest sweat, where the local folks come to trade a handful of grain for a bit of mending. But Moline had a secret weapon, and that weapon was the river. The Mississippi, that great brown winding artery of the continent, has always been the primary mover of dreams. It flows with a purpose, dragging the debris of 1,000 miles toward the sea, and it has a way of convincing the towns along its banks that they are part of something much larger than their own local elections. In Moline, the river provided more than just a view. It provided the power. It was a giant liquid engine, constantly churning, constantly moving, constantly whispering to the men on its banks, "Make something, move something, build something." And so they built. The blacksmith shop expanded. It didn't do so by the decree of a board of directors or the careful planning of a committee. It grew because the demand for that scouring plow, that miraculous polished piece of steel that had turned the prairie into a playground, became so loud it could be heard across 3 states. Men arrived from the north, the south, and the west, leading weary teams of horses and carrying with them the desperation of men who had spent their entire lives battling the dirt and losing. They came to Moline as pilgrims, and they left as farmers. The town transformed. The quiet, sleepy streets of the riverfront began to hum with the sound of 1,000 hammers striking iron in unison. It was a rhythmic, industrial symphony, a metallic heartbeat that announced to the world that Moline was no longer just a place to cross the river. It was a place to manufacture the future. Buildings sprang up overnight, great brick-walled cathedrals of production where the air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and the sparks of the forge flew like fireflies in the twilight. It was a miracle of sorts. To see a small operation bloom into an industrial fortress is to witness the sheer unadulterated audacity of the human spirit. It is the moment when a community realizes that it is no longer waiting for the world to come to it, but is instead reaching out to grab the world by the throat and pull it closer. The locals, who once spent their afternoons discussing the humidity and the likelihood of a late frost, now spent their time talking about output, capacity, and efficiency. It is a dreary vocabulary, if you ask me, but it was the language of the new age. They were building machines that were destined to march across the plains, and they took a fierce, stubborn pride in it. They looked at the green and yellow paint jobs rolling out of the shops, and they saw not just tools, but extensions of their own hard-won ingenuity. There is, however, a humorous irony in the Moline miracle. As the town became a powerhouse of agricultural innovation, the residents began to view the rest of the world with a mixture of pity and condescension. If you lived in Moline, you were at the center of the mechanical solar system. Everything else was just a cold, dark orbit. A man who came to town with a plow from a different make, a competitor, a pretender, a piece of iron that lacked the proper polish, was viewed with the same suspicion one might reserve for a man wearing a top hat to a barn dance. He was an outsider. He was a non-believer. He was, in the parlance of the time, missing the point. The town became a magnet for every man who wanted to trade a hoe for a machine, a life of back-breaking toil for a life of managed power. It drew in the inventors, the dreamers, and the scoundrels who saw an opportunity to make a fortune in the tractor business. It was a bustling, chaotic, and utterly vibrant petri dish of progress. You could walk down the street and hear the collision of languages, the clatter of heavy carts on the cobblestones, and the constant reassuring roar of the factories that never seemed to sleep. Yet underneath the clatter and the pride, there remained the fundamental truth of the prairie. Moline was building machines to conquer the dirt, but the dirt was still there. The river was still there, and the sky, vast and indifferent, still looked down upon the entire spectacle with the calm, detached gaze of the eternal. I often think of those early days in Moline and wonder if they knew what they were starting. Did they know that they were not just making plows, but building the foundation of a lifestyle that would eventually require its own religion, its own jargon, and its own peculiar sense of moral superiority? Did they know that they were changing the way we think about the very earth we stand on? Probably not. They were too busy working. They were too busy trying to keep up with the orders, too busy smoothing out the kinks in the production line, and too busy, bless them, ensuring that every single blade that left the factory floor was polished to that precise mirror-like quality that would make a prairie farmer weep with joy. It is a grand ironclad comedy when you look at it from a distance. A few men in a river town, armed with a bit of steel and a lot of nerve, decided to take on the most stubborn terrain in the world, and in doing so, they created a machine for life. They turned a blacksmith shop into an industrial fortress, and in the process, they turned Moline into a place where the air itself seemed to vibrate with the hum of the future. The miracle was not that they succeeded, for success is a common enough thing if one is willing to put in the hours and ignore the siren song of the snooze button. The miracle was that they managed to do it all while keeping the smell of the river, the heat of the forge, and the peculiar, stubborn, small-town character of the place intact. They took the wilderness and they ironed it out. They smoothed it over with a coat of green paint and a dash of yellow trim, and they sent it out into the world with a sense of purpose that was, frankly, a little bit terrifying. The prairie was still vast, and it was still waiting. But for the first time in history, it had been served a notice that the game was changing. The blacksmith shop had become a factory. The factory had become a city. And the city was about to change the world. And all this, mind you, because a man once looked at a piece of scrap metal and saw a way to stop his own swearing. If that isn't the definition of a miracle, then I suppose I don't know what is. It is the triumph of the practical over the impossible, the victory of the human hand over the sticky, relentless earth, and the glorious, noisy, soot-covered, and utterly inevitable march of progress, one furrow and one Moline-made machine at a time. Chapter 7. The Horsepower Heist. There is a natural ordained order to the universe, and it dictates that a beast of burden should possess, at the very minimum, a stomach, a tail, and a profound soulful understanding of its own misery. For centuries, the farmer and the mule had existed in a state of mutual weary consensus. The mule would pull, the farmer would swear, and both would retire to the barn at the end of the day with a shared sense of grievances against the cruelty of the sun. It was a sturdy biological arrangement. It was consistent. It was quiet, save for the occasional bray of protest from the animal or the occasional cry of supplication from the man. Then came the internal combustion engine, and with it, the great, sputtering, clanking, and utterly deafening horsepower heist. It began not with a bang, but with a series of tentative wheezing coughs that sounded like an asthmatic giant attempting to clear his throat. When the first tractors appeared, sputtering across the fields like metallic beetles possessed by the spirit of a disgruntled steamship, the local livestock was, quite frankly, appalled. The horses, who had spent their lives believing that work was a four-legged affair, looked upon these vibrating, oil-leaking monstrosities with the sort of disdain a gentleman reserves for a man who eats his peas with a knife. The farmers, however, were not so dismissive. They were a people who had been conditioned by the promise of the Scour to believe that if something could be polished, it could be conquered. And if something could be replaced by a machine that didn't need to be fed, watered, or argued with, then the transition was not just logical, it was inevitable. The horsepower heist was the quiet, mechanical theft of the animal kingdom's job description. The tractor arrived, smelling of gasoline and cheap excitement, and it informed the mule that his services were no longer required in the grand theater of agriculture. It was a cold, efficient transition. The tractor did not tire. It did not need to sleep. It did not have off days, where it would decide to plant its feet in the mud and refuse to budge because it had taken a sudden dislike to the farmer's choice of headwear. No, the tractor was the ultimate expression of the industrial age. It was a slave that didn't need to be bribed with oats. But oh, the transition was a comedy of errors. In those early years, the tractor was less of a precision tool and more of a mechanical calamity. It would shake with such violent intensity that the farmer's fillings would rattle in his head like loose change in a coat pocket. It would leak oil with the persistence of a sieve, creating little puddles of environmental compromise wherever it stood, and heaven help the man who had to start it on a cold winter morning. It required a crank, a prayer, and a level of physical exertion that would have left a professional wrestler gasping for air. There were stories, told no doubt by the displaced mules with a sense of grim satisfaction, of tractors that would decide, in the middle of a delicate row of corn, that they had quite enough of the whole business and would simply expire, emitting one final, mournful puff of black smoke before going silent. The farmer would then have to spend the rest of the day cussing at the carburetor, which was a machine of such bewildering complexity that it seemed to have been designed by a committee of mad scientists with a grudge against humanity. Yet the farmer persisted. He had caught the fever. He wanted that power. He wanted to look out over his 100 acres and feel that he was commanding an army of iron, not merely leading a confused beast by a bridle. The horsepower heist was in full swing, and the tractor was its undisputed king. One has to appreciate the sheer audacity of replacing a creature that had been with man since the dawn of civilization with a box of gears that smelled of petroleum. It was a profound shift in the human relationship with the land. The mule was a companion, however frustrating. The tractor was a machine. You could talk to a mule. You could vent your troubles, express your rage, or share a bit of gossip. And the animal would listen with an ear-flicking indifference that was, in its own way, a form of therapy. You cannot talk to a tractor. Well, you can, but it doesn't listen, and it certainly doesn't empathize. If you try to share your woes with a carburetor, it will likely just spit fuel in your eye and demand a new spark plug. The transition from the animal-drawn era to the combustion era was the moment we traded the heartbeat of the farm for the thrum of the engine. It was a trade-off that defined the 20th century. We gained efficiency, we gained speed, and we gained the ability to farm vast swathes of land that would have crushed a team of horses. But we lost the connection. We lost the rhythm of the gait, the sound of the hooves against the earth, and the gentle biological pacing of a world that understood its own limitations. The tractor, in its early clanking, shuddering glory, was a symbol of our desire to outrun time itself. We wanted more. We wanted faster. We wanted to be able to turn the soil while sitting on a cushioned seat, shielded from the elements, as if we were riding a very loud, very dusty chariot into the future. The horsepower heist was complete. The horses were put out to pasture, where they spent their days wondering what on earth had possessed their masters to trade a loyal, warm-blooded friend for a cold, vibrating heap of cast iron that required a wrench to fix its moods. The landscape began to change, too. The fields became larger, the fences were torn down, and the quiet, intimate scale of the family farm began to swell into the massive industrial operation we recognize today. Looking back at this moment in our history, one cannot help but laugh at the sheer absurdity of it all. We took the most beautiful, organic, and time-honored partnership in the history of the world and replaced it with a machine that leaked, rattled, and required a degree in engineering just to move in a straight line. We traded the mule for the motor, the bray for the backfire, and the steady, plodding pace of nature for the frantic, impatient roar of the internal combustion engine. And yet, despite the leakages, the vibrations, and the occasional spectacular mechanical failure that would leave a farmer stranded 3 miles from the barn in a torrential downpour, the tractor won. It won because it offered us the one thing we crave above all else, the illusion of control. We didn't have to rely on the mule's mood. We didn't have to rely on the animal's strength. We could force the machine to work as long as we had enough fuel and enough stubbornness to keep it running. It was a heist, yes, a theft of the animal's dignity and the farmer's peace of mind. But it was also a triumph, a messy, oily, noisy, and occasionally tragic triumph, but a triumph nonetheless. We had declared war on the limits of the biological world, and we had won. We were now masters of our own mechanical destiny, free to churn the earth at a pace that would have horrified our ancestors. But I wonder sometimes, when I see a modern tractor, that sleek, computerized, satellite-guided giant that hums with the efficiency of a Swiss watch, if it ever longs for the days of the mule. Does it ever miss the honest, physical resistance of an animal that could pull back? Does it ever feel lonely, sitting out in the middle of 1,000 acres, controlled by a man who is staring at a screen in the farmhouse, miles away, rather than sitting in the seat, feeling the dirt and the pull of the plow? The horsepower heist gave us everything we asked for, and in the grand whimsical comedy of progress, we are still paying the interest. We have the speed, we have the power, and we have the neon green harvesters to prove it. But I suspect that if you ask the old-timers, they might tell you that there was something to be said for the mule, a creature that, for all its stubbornness, never needed an oil change, never broke down in the middle of a storm, and always knew, deep in its heart, that the work of the farm was something to be shared, not just conquered. Chapter 8. The Great Tractor Transformation. It is a curious quirk of the American soul that we possess a distinct inability to leave a tool alone once it has proven its utility. If a thing works, we are compelled to make it louder. If it is loud, we are compelled to make it larger. And if it is large, we are compelled to treat it as if it were a high priest of the agrarian order entitled to our deepest reverence, our constant attention, and a significant portion of our household budget. Thus it was with the tractor, which, having successfully completed its heist of the mule's duties, proceeded to undergo a transformation so radical that it ceased to be a mere machine and morphed into a lifestyle, a clanking, vibrating, oil-scented secular religion that demanded everything from its parishioners. There was a time, shortly after the horsepower heist, when a farmer regarded his tractor with a healthy, skeptical detachment. It was a tool like a hoe or a shovel, only significantly more prone to breaking and far more expensive to insult. But as the years rolled on and the machines grew from modest, sputtering runabouts into the gargantuan, multi-ton behemoths of the middle century, the relationship shifted. The tractor became the centerpiece of the farm's theology. Observe, if you will, the Saturday morning ritual of the modern farmer. He does not head to the fields with a song in his heart. He heads to the machinery shed with a tool kit in his hand and a look of profound, meditative seriousness on his face. He approaches the tractor not as a man approaching a piece of hardware, but as a priest approaching an altar. He circles the machine, inspecting the tires, checking the oil, and listening to the faint metallic ticks of the engine as if it were whispering the secrets of the harvest to him. It is a machine so loud it possesses the unique and terrifying ability to shake the fillings right out of a man's teeth, a true tactile experience of industrial progress. Yet the farmer bears this with the stoic pride of a man who knows that suffering is simply the price of admission for superior performance. He loves the roar. He loves the vibration. He loves the way the ground beneath him trembles, as if the earth itself is quivering in fear at the arrival of such a powerful green and yellow deity. The tractor had become a lifestyle. It was no longer just about turning the dirt. It was about the status of the turn. A man was measured by the horsepower he commanded, the width of the implement he dragged behind him, and the amount of proprietary electronic wizardry that blinked at him from the dashboard. To own a small, modest tractor was to be a man of modest, quiet ambition. But to own a tractor that required a ladder to mount, that boasted more computing power than the Apollo moon missions, and that could pull a small mountain behind it without breaking a sweat, that was a man who had arrived. That was a man whose bank manager likely checked in on him with a nervous, trembling frequency. It is a peculiar, self-reinforcing cycle. The farmer buys a larger tractor to farm more land. To pay for the larger tractor, he must farm more land. To farm more land, he must buy an even larger tractor. It is a logic so circular that it would make a philosopher dizzy. Yet it is the bedrock of the modern agricultural experience. It is a race to the horizon, where the prize for winning is simply the opportunity to buy a bigger machine next season. And let us speak of the reliability. Oh, the reliability of the modern tractor. It is so absolute, so unwavering, that it has achieved the status of a secular miracle. A man might have a crisis in his marriage. He might have a disagreement with his neighbors, or he might have a fundamental existential crisis regarding his place in the universe, but he does not worry about his tractor. It is the one thing he can trust. It will start, it will run, and it will endure. It is the rock upon which he builds his farm, a mechanical companion that asks for nothing but fuel, maintenance, and perhaps a bit of quiet admiration. There are those who claim that this is not a religion, but simple pragmatism. I beg to differ. Pragmatism is a thing that stays in the shed when it is not needed. This tractor, this green and yellow behemoth, is always on the mind. It is a presence. It is a silent sentinel at the edge of the property, a symbol of the farmer's industry and the company's success. It is the focus of all conversation at the local diner, where the talk inevitably drifts from the weather to the merits of this brand versus that, to the specific, excruciating details of the latest transmission overhaul. It is a language of its own, a jargon of torque, hydraulic pressure, and fuel efficiency that excludes anyone who hasn't spent at least 10 hours in the driver's seat. It is a brotherhood, a secret society of men and women who understand the deep, resonant satisfaction of watching a perfectly turned furrow appear in the wake of their machine. It is a shared, intimate struggle against the stubbornness of the land, mediated by the mechanical God they have chosen to serve. One wonders, in the quiet, reflective hours of the evening, if we haven't wandered a bit too far into the forest of our own invention. We started by wanting to escape the mud. We ended up constructing a shrine to the very machines that helped us do it. We have become so dependent on these iron monsters that we can barely imagine a world where the power to create a harvest comes from our own hands. We have handed over the keys to the kingdom to the manufacturer, trusting in the software, the steel, and the brand to keep us fed and prosperous. Is it a sustainable way to live? Perhaps not. But it is certainly a colorful one. There is something undeniably majestic about those massive green and yellow machines prowling the fields under a summer sun, their silhouettes etched against the skyline like the war machines of a benevolent, harvest-minded empire. They possess a beauty that is entirely their own, the beauty of raw power, of absolute utility, and of the unwavering mechanical persistence of man. The tractor, transformed from a simple, mud-defying plow into a complex, lifestyle-defining beast has become the defining image of our time. It is the silent, humming witness to our ambitions and the loud, clanking testament to our ingenuity. It is the machine that built our modern world, and it is the machine that keeps us tethered to the soil, even as we look to the satellites for guidance. We treat it with reverence, we maintain it with religious fervor, and we invest our fortunes in its promise. It is the great, vibrating heartbeat of the prairie, a rhythm that pulsates beneath the soles of our feet and dictates the flow of our lives. We have made our peace with the noise. We have grown accustomed to the vibration, and we have accepted the tractor as a permanent, essential member of the family. So, if you ever find yourself driving through the heart of the country and you see a man standing by his tractor, head bowed, hands resting on the steering wheel as if in silent prayer, do not be alarmed. He is not having a nervous breakdown, or at least not in the way you might suspect. He is simply communing with his machine. He is participating in the great tractor transformation, a ritual as old as the industry itself. And he is finding, in the hum of the engine and the smell of the diesel, a kind of solace that the rest of the world has long since forgotten. He is a servant to the green and yellow faith, and in his own way, he is the happiest man in the county, for he knows the truth that the rest of us have yet to grasp, that the secret to a well-lived life is not found in the stillness of the parlor, but in the steady, relentless, and perfectly tuned roar of a machine that is working exactly as it was designed. Chapter 9. The Anatomy of a Combine. If the tractor is the high priest of the farm's theology, then the combine harvester is surely the cathedral itself, a sprawling, intricate, and utterly bewildered piece of architecture that seems to have been designed by a man who was simultaneously reading a manual on clockwork, a blueprint for a steamship, and a very vivid comic book about extraterrestrial invasions. To stand before a modern combine is to contemplate a machine that defies the very notion of humility. It does not merely harvest, it consumes. It approaches a field of grain with the appetite of a mythological beast and the mechanical complexity of a small, angry city. I have often pondered whether the engineers who draft these behemoths are driven by a genuine desire for efficiency or by a secret, malevolent urge to see how many thousands of moving parts they can fit into a single frame before the laws of physics simply throw up their hands and resign. A combine is not a tool. It is an argument. It is a debate between the grain, the chaff, the rotating blades, the augers, and the human being who is currently standing at the base of the machine, staring into its guts with a look of profound existential bewilderment. The anatomy of the thing is a wonder to behold. It has a header, a rotating skeletal affair that reaches out to the wheat with the desperate grasping fingers of a drowning man, and it feeds the stalks into a labyrinth of threshing drums, sieves, blowers, and conveyors. It is a process of such astonishing violence that it is a miracle any grain survives it all. The machine screams, it shudders, it coughs up clouds of dust that would choke a dragon, and somewhere, deep in its mechanical bowels, it performs a transformation that is nothing short of alchemy. It takes the chaotic, tangled mess of the field and spits out a clean, golden treasure. But observe the cost of this miracle. To operate a combine requires a degree in mechanical engineering, a direct line to the divine, and an unshakable, almost pathological belief in the concept of routine maintenance. For every hour that the machine spends gracefully, or more accurately, thunderously devouring the acres, it demands 3 hours of adoration in the shed. The operator must crawl beneath it, climb inside it, and spend his afternoons waist-deep in grease, cursing the day he decided that farming was a profession rather than a hobby. It is a machine that demands sacrifice. It demands the skin off one's knuckles, the patience of a saint, and a vocabulary of profanity that would make a seasoned riverboat captain blush with admiration. And yet there is a certain dark and highly infectious majesty to the combine. When it is working, when the dust is flying, the engine is purring with that low, throaty, ground-shaking roar, and the grain tank is filling up with the literal fruits of the earth. It is a sight of unparalleled grandeur. The farmer sits high up in the cab, insulated from the world by thick glass and air conditioning, looking down on the field like a monarch surveying his dominion. He is the master of the harvest. He is the controller of the chaos. He is the pilot of a land-bound starship, navigating the roads with the quiet, intense focus of a man who knows that one loose bolt is all that stands between a successful season and a catastrophic pile of scrap metal. The sheer size of the thing is enough to make a man feel remarkably small. It is tall enough to peer into second-story windows. It is wide enough to make the local roads feel like threadbare ribbons of asphalt. And it is expensive enough to make one wonder if perhaps we should have just traded the whole farming operation for a nice, sensible gold mine. But size, in the world of the combine, is a necessity. The prairie is vast, the season is short, and the sun is as indifferent as it is hot. If you want to finish the job before the sky decides to open up and ruin your hard-won bounty, you need a machine that can do the work of an entire village of manual laborers, and you need it to do it before the week is out. I once watched a man spend an entire afternoon attempting to fix a stubborn, jammed auger. He was covered in sweat, dirt, and oil, a spectacle of human frustration that could have served as a warning to all of mankind. He would turn a bolt, and a spring would fly off into the weeds. He would realign a belt, and a warning light would begin to flash on the dashboard with the relentless, mocking persistence of a heartbeat. It was a tragedy of errors, a performance that required the physical endurance of an acrobat and the mental fortitude of a monk. "Why do you do it?" I asked him after he had finally emerged, his face a mask of grease and exhaustion. "Why do you wrestle with this ironclad monster when you could simply hire a few strong hands to do the work with a sickle?" He looked at me with a gaze so weary it could have aged a bottle of wine. "Because," he said, wiping his hands on a rag that was already black with years of grime, "a man can't eat pride, but he can eat the harvest, and this machine is the only way to get it done. It's a beast, sure. It's a fickle, expensive, soul-crushing piece of engineering, but when it's running, when the grain is hitting the tank, there's no sound on this earth that's quite as sweet." And there, I suppose, is the truth of it. The combine is a monument to our own stubbornness. We have created a machine so complex that it requires our constant fawning attention, a machine that is almost designed to fail at the worst possible moment, and we love it for it. We love it because it represents our victory over the scale of the world. We have taken the vast, infinite, and overwhelming prairie, and we have built a beast that can swallow it one mouthful at a time until the work is finished. It is a satirical masterpiece, really. We have constructed a technological behemoth to simplify our labor, only to find that the beast requires more labor than the manual work it was meant to replace. We have traded the back-breaking toll of the handheld sickle for the brain-breaking toll of the wrench and the manual. We are, as a species, remarkably good at creating our own problems and then being absolutely delighted when we find a complex, expensive, and wonderfully noisy way to solve them. So, the next time you see a combine harvesting the horizon, don't just see a piece of agricultural equipment. See the cathedral of the prairie. See the monument to human audacity. See the giant, clanking, dust-belching realization of a dream that was hatched in a blacksmith shop long ago when all we wanted was a plow that didn't stick to the mud. We got that, and a whole lot more besides. We got the combine, the harvester of our harvests, the consumer of our time, and the undisputed oil-stained king of the crop. And if it requires a prayer to the heavens and 3 hours of maintenance for every hour of work, well, that's just the price of the show. And heaven knows it's a show worth seeing. Chapter 10. The Dealer's Altar. If you wish to locate the true spiritual center of a rural community, do not look for the town hall, and for heaven's sake, do not look for the post office. No, if you want to find where the pulse of the county truly beats, you must find the local John Deere dealership. It is there, amidst the gleaming chrome and the towering sky-piercing rubber tires, that the local farmers gather to engage in their most sacred liturgy, the worship of the million-dollar machine. The dealership is not merely a place of commerce. It is a sanctuary, a cathedral of capital, and a coffee house where the prices of grain and the vagaries of the rain are debated with the fervor of a theological council. It is a place where a man can wander among the iron titans, run his hand over the polished green paint, and lose himself in the quiet, reverent contemplation of what it would be like to sit in a cockpit that boasts more buttons than a nervous politician's waistcoat. The coffee is always free, and it is always terrible. A thin, acidic brew that tastes vaguely of burnt beans and broken dreams, but it serves its purpose. It provides a reason for the farmers to linger. They huddle around the pot, their caps pulled low, their eyes darting toward the showroom floor where a new top-of-the-line tractor sits like a gilded idol on a pedestal. They talk about the weather, they talk about the debt, and they talk about the transmission, but mostly they talk about the possibility. "She's a beauty, isn't she?" one might say, nodding toward the tractor. It is a statement that requires no elaboration. The beauty of the tractor is a given, a foundational truth that requires no proof, like the fact that the sun rises in the east or that a man's boots will always eventually fill with mud. "Too much computer," another will reply, shaking his head with a mixture of suspicion and longing. "Too much sensor. If she breaks down in the North 40, you can't just tap her with a hammer and be on your way. You have to call the dealer, and the dealer has to call the factory, and by the time you're back to tilling, you've missed the season entirely." They all agree with solemn nods that the old days were better, that the machines were simpler, and that the world has gone quite mad with its electronics. But then one of them will move closer to the machine, his hand reaching out to touch the joystick, his eyes glazing over with the distinct vacant look of a man who is picturing himself in the cab, steering that green behemoth through a field of corn at a pace that would make his grandfather faint with terror. The dealership is the altar where the farmer pays his respects to the modern world. He knows, deep down, that he is financing a machine the size of a suburban house, and he knows that the interest rates are a form of legalized larceny. But he stands before the machine and feels the pull of the future. He sees the potential for a larger yield, for a faster harvest, and for a life that is, in some small, measurable way, a little bit more efficient than the one he is living. He is buying into the brand, the promise, and the persistent, nagging belief that if he just had the right machine, the struggle with the prairie would finally, mercifully, come to an end. The dealer, of course, is the high priest of this temple. He is a man who understands that his job is not merely to sell a tractor, but to nurture a dream. He knows that he is not selling steel and rubber. He is selling a vision of a future where the farmer is the master of his domain, where the technology works, and where the bank account finally stays in the black. He is a master of the gentle nudge, the well-timed compliment, and the subtle implication that a man who doesn't upgrade this season is, frankly, a man who is falling behind the times. He knows the names of the farmers' children, he knows the history of their land, and he knows exactly when to mention the new financing package that makes the unaffordable seem, for a brief, glowing moment, like a remarkably sound business investment. It is a curious scene when you stop to consider it. A group of grown men standing in a brightly lit room filled with machinery that costs as much as a small fleet of luxury cars, sipping terrible coffee and discussing the merits of a hydraulic lift. It is a spectacle of the highest order, a demonstration of the sheer, unadulterated power of the human need to possess, to control, and to believe in the machinery that keeps the world turning. I once sat in a corner of such a dealership, just listening to the hum of the conversation, and I was struck by the profound, unspoken camaraderie. These are men who work alone for most of their lives, pitted against the elements and the stubbornness of the dirt, and this dealership is their only true community. It is where they validate one another's struggles. It is where they compare the size of their fields, the quality of their corn, and the reliability of their equipment. It is where they find a shared sense of purpose in the face of an uncertain, changing, and frequently indifferent world. And the machinery itself. Oh, the machinery. It sits there in the showroom, polished to a mirror sheen, looking for all the world like a display of modern art in a gallery for the mechanically obsessed. You can see the reflection of the shop lights in the hood, and you can see the anticipation in the eyes of the men who gather around it. It is the crown jewel of the American farm, the silent, hulking green and yellow sentinel that promises to bring order to the chaos of the harvest. It is a temple of industry, and like all temples, it has its contradictions. It preaches the virtues of self-reliance, yet it is built on a foundation of proprietary software and complex, manufacturer-controlled technology that ensures the farmer is never truly independent. It promises a life of ease, yet it demands a lifetime of debt and a constant frantic search for more land to justify the cost of the machine. It is a place of hope, and it is a place of anxiety. It is, in every sense of the word, a human place. I walked out of that dealership into the bright open air of the afternoon, and I looked out at the rolling hills of the Midwest. The land was quiet, as it always is, indifferent to the price of tractors, the cost of parts, and the hopes of the men who stood inside, drinking their bad coffee and dreaming of the next harvest. The machinery we build is magnificent, and it is essential, and it is, in its own way, quite beautiful. But as I watched the wind ripple through a nearby field, I couldn't help but wonder if we haven't lost something along the way. If in our rush to build bigger, faster, and more expensive machines, we haven't forgotten that the prairie doesn't need our permission to grow, and it certainly doesn't care about the color of our tractors. But that, I suppose, is a realization for a much quieter place than a John Deere dealership. Inside, the show must go on. The coffee must be brewed, the deals must be made, and the farmers must continue to gaze upon those green and yellow idols with the same wide-eyed wonder as a pilgrim gazing at the relics of a saint. For in the heart of the Midwest, the tractor is the dream, and the dealer's altar is the only place left to pray. And frankly, as far as rituals go, I've seen far worse. At least, the tractor, for all its faults, actually does the work. And in a world that is increasingly full of empty promises and broken machines, that is, perhaps, a miracle in its own right. Chapter 11. The Global Conquest. Now, it is a well-documented curiosity of the American spirit that we are entirely incapable of keeping a good thing to ourselves. We have a congenital urge to export our inventions, our philosophies, and our particular brand of mechanical madness to every corner of the map, regardless of whether the locals have requested them, or indeed whether they have the faintest idea what to do with them once they arrive. Thus, the John Deere machine, which began its life as a modest solution to an Illinois mud problem, found itself on a boat, and then another boat, and then, before you could say manifest destiny, it was being offloaded in the heart of the Sahara, the plains of Argentina, and the sodden tea-scented corners of the British Isles. The green and yellow were going global, and the world, bless its unsuspecting heart, had no idea what was about to hit it. One might imagine that farming is a universal language, and to a certain extent it is. The soil, the seed, the rain, and the sun are the same the world over. But the audacity of the John Deere operation, that was a distinctly American export. It brought with it a philosophy that suggested that farming was not a way of life, but an industrial process that could be perfected, polished, and painted in neon hues. I imagine the reaction of a farmer in the heart of a remote African savanna upon seeing his first modern combine harvester. He is accustomed to the pace of the seasons, to the gentle, rhythmic collaboration between man, beast, and the natural cycle. And suddenly, here comes a machine the size of a small cathedral, groaning with the weight of 1,000 gears, belching diesel smoke into the pristine morning air, and demanding that the horizon be subdivided into perfectly uniform squares. It must have felt like an alien invasion. One can almost hear the local wildlife pausing in their grazing to observe the monstrosity, their eyes wide with the realization that the era of quiet, dignified existence was officially coming to a close. The genius of the global conquest was not in the machine itself, but in the assumption that the prairie grudge was a universal condition. The men in Moline, having spent decades conquering the Illinois gumbo, were quite convinced that the entire world was suffering from the same sticky, adhesive affliction. They carried with them the belief that every field on earth, whether it was in the frozen reach of the steppes or the humid valleys of the tropics, was secretly dying for a piece of steel that was polished to a mirror shine. And in a twist of irony that would have delighted the ancients, they were largely right. The struggle against the weeds is indeed a universal, unceasing, and frequently demoralizing enterprise. It matters little if you are in Iowa or in the heart of the Sahara. If you want to grow a crop, you must do battle with the earth's natural inclination to revert to a state of untamed, tangled, and utterly unproductive wildness. The Deere machine, with its promise of efficiency and its imposing green and yellow-clad confidence, was a universal answer to a universal complaint. It offered a kind of mechanical salvation. It said, "Look here, we have figured out how to make the earth behave, and for the low, low price of your entire financial future, you can enjoy the same freedom from the tyranny of the weeds." It was a brilliant bit of diplomacy. We didn't send diplomats to talk about democracy. We sent tractors to talk about torque. We didn't send philosophers to discuss the meaning of labor. We sent harvesters to demonstrate the power of the yield. But consider the comedy of it. The John Deere dealer in the heart of Europe or the Far East must have been a man of immense and perhaps slightly dangerous imaginative capacity. He had to take the Moline mythology, the tale of the blacksmith, the saw blade, and the grudge of the prairie, and translate it for an audience that had never seen a cornfield, let alone a piece of Illinois mud. He had to convince a man who had farmed his family's ancestral lands for 8 centuries, using nothing but a wooden hoe and a prayer that his life was fundamentally incomplete without a hydraulic pressurized computer-assisted neon green and profoundly expensive beast of burden. And he did it. That is the truly magnificent part. The brand became a symbol not just of agriculture but of modernity itself. To own a John Deere was to declare yourself a citizen of the 20th century. It was a badge of progress, a signal that you were no longer content with the slow, deliberate pace of the ancestors, but were ready to embrace the frantic, industrial, and highly optimized future. It is a fascinating, if somewhat terrifying, homogenization of the human experience. We have successfully exported our farming habits to the ends of the earth, creating a world where the struggle for calories looks remarkably similar, regardless of the cultural context. We have managed to make the act of turning the soil into a global, industrialized, and highly branded enterprise. The same green and yellow machinery hums across the plains of every continent, a silent mechanical language that unites the global farmer in a common, grease-stained quest for the perfect harvest. But one does wonder, as we look at this vast green and yellow dappled map, what has been lost in the translation. In our rush to make the world behave, in our desire to apply the Illinois solution to the entirety of the planet, have we flattened the nuances of the local experience? Have we replaced the wisdom of the traditional farmer with the manual of the manufacturer? The prairie is vast, and the struggle against the weeds is eternal. But surely the ways of the earth were meant to be as diverse as the people who walk upon it. By imposing our specific, Moline-born vision of agriculture, have we created a world that is more productive? Yes, but perhaps a bit more hollow? Are we all just different versions of the same farmer, staring at the same dashboard, worrying about the same transmission, and praying to the same mechanical god? It is a whimsical thought, really. The idea of a John Deere harvester in the middle of a remote mountain valley, miles from anything that resembles a modern road, looking like a misplaced giant from another dimension. It serves as a reminder of our incredible and frequently misguided propensity for influence. We want the whole world to look like our backyard, and we have the machinery to ensure that it does. The global conquest of the green and yellow machine is a testament to the power of the American story, a story that tells us that any problem can be solved with enough steel, enough polish, and enough ambition. It is a story that has resonated across the seas and across the cultures, proving that at the end of the day, everyone wants the same thing: to conquer the earth, to harvest the bounty, and to do it with a machine that looks impressive enough to make the neighbors stare. And if along the way we have made the world a little bit more uniform, a little bit more expensive, and a little bit noisier, well, that is simply the price of progress. The march of the machinery continues across every border and every time zone, a relentless green and yellow river of iron that shows no signs of slowing down. The prairie's grudge, it seems, has become a global affair, and it is being challenged, one polished blade at a time, by the most successful blacksmith shop in the history of the world. And honestly, given the alternative, I suppose we could have exported something far worse. At least the tractor, for all its audacity, helps to feed the world, and if it does so with a bit of neon-colored flair, well, that's just the American way. Chapter 12. The Folklore of the Logo. If you venture into the heart of the countryside on a day when the air is still and the corn is listening, you will eventually find yourself staring at a small, green and yellow emblem fixed to the side of some gargantuan piece of iron. It is the leaping deer. It is a creature of simple, bold geometry, captured mid-bound, its antlers high, and its hooves tucked in a posture of permanent, optimistic momentum. You have seen it 1,000 times, I'm sure. It is the silent sentinel of the harvest, the patron saint of the furrow, and the most recognizable piece of wildlife in the entire history of the Great Plains. It is a curious thing, when you stop to think about it, the choice of the deer. One does not associate the deer with the farm. The deer, in the natural pre-industrial order of things, is the primary antagonist of the farmer. It is the creature that jumps the fence, munches the tender shoots, and generally treats the entire agricultural project as a personal, buffet-style dinner invitation. To place a deer upon the side of one's tractor is, to the suspicious mind, something akin to a butcher hanging a picture of a cow in his front window, or a captain of a steamship naming his vessel the Iceberg. It is a move of supreme, almost reckless irony. And yet, there it sits, the leaping, graceful deer, presiding over a machine whose primary purpose is to rip up the habitat that the deer holds most dear. I suspect the choice was made not because of any deep, naturalist understanding of the forest, but because the deer possesses a quality that the manufacturer desperately craved: grace. The early machines, as we have discussed, were clanking, rattling, oil-leaking monstrosities that vibrated with the dignity of a runaway freight train. They were not graceful. They were not subtle. They were not, by any stretch of the imagination, the sort of thing you would invite to a garden party. By pinning that elegant leaping deer to the side of the engine, the company was attempting a bit of branding alchemy. They were trying to suggest that within that hulking mechanical beast there lived the spirit of something quick, something light, and something entirely at home in the landscape it was so aggressively modifying. It is a wonderful, whimsical piece of mythology, The deer has likely never been seen in a cornfield, except perhaps as a fleeting, panicked shadow fleeing the encroaching roar of the harvester. It is a stranger to the furrow, and yet it has become the silent, watchful guardian of the harvest, the spirit animal of the modern farm. It has been scrubbed of its identity as a garden pest in chief and transformed into a symbol of speed, agility, and the relentless, upward-bound energy of the American industry. There is a whole folklore that has grown up around the logo, as is the habit of humanity when confronted with a symbol that refuses to be ignored. There are those who will tell you, in the hushed, reverent tones of a man explaining the mysteries of the universe, that the deer represents the soul of the machine, that the engineers in Moline spent years attempting to capture the exact, fluid motion of a startled buck in flight, translating it into the very curve of the hydraulic lines and the tilt of the steering column. They say that if you look closely at the machine while it is running, you can see the spirit of the deer in the way it handles the soil, turning the earth with the same effortless, leaping grace. It is, of course, complete and utter nonsense, but it is a delightful kind of nonsense. It is the sort of story that makes the long hours of maintenance seem a little more poetic, and the sheer, brutal size of the combine seem a little more natural. The logo has become more than just a mark of ownership. It is a badge of belonging. I have seen it emblazoned on the caps of retired farmers in the local diner, sewn onto the jackets of toddlers who have yet to master the concept of walking, and painted, with the devotion of a medieval iconographer, onto the sides of barns that have seen more years than the company itself. It is a symbol that says, I am part of the tribe. It says, I understand the language of the land, and I speak it with the dialect of the green and yellow. There is something undeniably clever about it. In a world that is increasingly complex, technical, and prone to the cold, impersonal language of software and satellites, the deer is a touch of the organic, a reminder of the wilder, simpler world that existed before the first plow was ever dragged through the prairie grass. It is a way of softening the edges of the industrial age. It is a bridge between the machine and the meadow, a bit of whimsy that allows the farmer to pretend, for a few hours a day, that he is not just a cog in the great corporate agricultural machine, but a steward of something much older and much more mysterious. I have often wondered if the deer is happy about this arrangement. It is a creature of the woods, meant for dappled light and the quiet rustle of the leaves. Instead, it finds itself stuck in a permanent, bronze-colored, or perhaps neon yellow state of suspended animation, forever leaping over the side of a diesel-powered harvester that is currently churning through 1,000 acres of corn. It is a life of eternal mechanical captivity. Perhaps if you look at the logo long enough, you can see in its frozen, upward-bound expression not a sense of grace, but a desperate, silent plea for a return to the forest. But then, that is the way of all our symbols. We take the things that we admire, the grace of the deer, the strength of the bull, the speed of the hawk, and we capture them, we simplify them, and we pin them to our machines, hoping that by some process of spiritual osmosis we can make our creations possess the qualities of the living. We want our tractors to leap. We want our combines to be as quick as a frightened buck. We want our industry to have the heartbeat of the wild. It is a noble, if entirely misguided, ambition, And the deer, that silent, leaping sentinel, remains the perfect manifestation of our dilemma. We love the wild, but we are too busy farming to leave it alone. We appreciate the grace of nature, but we are too committed to the efficiency of the machine to let it thrive. And so, we compromise. We leap with the deer, but we do it from the comfort of an air-conditioned, vibration-dampened, satellite-guided cab, and we leave the actual jumping to the logo on the door. It is a folklore of our own making, a legend that we have written in iron and paint. And the most interesting part of the story, I find, is how perfectly we have convinced ourselves that it is all quite reasonable. A deer on a harvester? Of course, it is the most natural thing in the world. It is a symbol of our stewardship, a mark of our mastery, and a reminder of the beauty that we are, in our own very noisy way, attempting to cultivate. I suspect that if the deer could speak, it would have a few choice words about the audacity of it all. It would probably tell us that the only way to truly understand the prairie is to stop, to listen, and to leave the iron in the shed for a day. But the deer cannot speak, and the tractor is currently idling, and there are 40 acres of corn that need to be harvested before the sun goes down. And so the logo remains. It leaps, it bounds, and it presides over the work of the farm, a silent, graceful, and utterly ironic witness to our obsession with the land. And if we look at it with enough reverence, for just a fleeting second, we might even convince ourselves that we are leaping with it, and that the world is a little bit more natural and a little bit more wild than it actually is. That is the true power of the folklore, and that is the true whimsical magic of the brand. It is the deer that never jumps, on a machine that never rests, in a field that is always waiting, and we wouldn't have it any other way. Chapter 13. The Right to Repair Rebellion. It is a curious and melancholy evolution that we have witnessed in this modern age, where the man who once held the master key to his own machine has found himself reduced to a mere spectator, standing helplessly in his own barnyard while his harvester sits in the dust, blinking a series of ominous coded warning lights at him like a suspicious lighthouse keeper. There was a time, in the golden era of the blacksmith and the wrench, when if a gear broke, a man took a hammer, a bit of grit, and a fair amount of bad language, and he fixed the thing. He was the master of his own iron. He owned the machine, and the machine in turn acknowledged his sovereignty. But today? Today, we have wandered into the dark labyrinthine woods of the proprietary software clause, a legal thicket so dense that no amount of honest sweat can hack through it. The modern farmer, who can track the moisture content of his soil from a satellite 300 miles above his head, has discovered that he is no longer allowed to turn a simple nut on his own transmission without first receiving a digital blessing from a computer server in a glass-walled office halfway across the continent. It is a rebellion of the wrench against the algorithm, and if you ask me, it is a conflict that would have made the old-timey bards of the Mississippi weep into their whiskey. The situation is this. Our green and yellow giants, those hulking satellite-guided marvels of modern engineering, have become infested with a digital soul, a black box of secret code that acts as both the brain and the jailer of the machine. When the harvester decides that it has had enough of the wheat, it does not simply break. It experiences a software malfunction. It informs the farmer, via a glowing, condescending screen, that it is no longer capable of performing its duties until it has been reauthorized by an approved technician. This technician, a man who likely hasn't spent an hour in a real furrow in his entire professional life, must then be summoned at great expense to plug a laptop into the machine's nervous system, perform a bit of digital hocus-pocus, and tell the machine that it is, in fact, permitted to keep working. To the farmer, this is not just an inconvenience. It is a profound existential insult. It is a violation of the fundamental contract between the man, the machine, and the land. The farmer has bought the iron. He has paid the mortgage. He has poured his lifeblood into the soil. And yet he finds that he is merely a renter of his own tools, a tenant in his own shed, subject to the whims of an absentee digital landlord who considers the act of tightening a bolt to be a form of corporate heresy. The rebellion, as you might imagine, is a quiet, simmering, and highly inventive affair. It does not manifest in the streets with banners and brass bands, for farmers are a pragmatic, solitary lot. No, the rebellion happens in the dim, grease-stained corners of the machine shed, where the new age of digital hackers is being born. There are now folks, young men and women, who have grown up with a soldering iron in one hand and a motherboard in the other, who are treating the tractor's software with the same irreverent back-alley ingenuity that the old-timers once applied to a busted carburetor. They are creating chipped software, building illicit diagnostic bridges, and sharing the secrets of the machine's inner code on the dark, whispering corners of the Internet. They are the new blacksmiths, the digital rogues of the wheat field, and they are engaged in the most important fight of our time, the fight for the right to hold a wrench to one's own property and not be treated like a common criminal for the effort. It is a comedy of the highest order when you look at it with the right perspective. We have spent an entire century building machines of such incredible complexity that they have finally achieved a level of technological arrogance that requires a digital uprising to keep them in check. The manufacturer, sitting in its corporate cathedral of glass and steel, insists that this complexity is for the farmer's own good, that it ensures safety, reliability, and optimal performance. But the farmer knows the truth. The farmer knows that the only thing being optimized is the manufacturer's ability to monopolize the repair. There is a deep, abiding irony in this. We have built a machine that is supposed to liberate us from the toil of the earth, only to find that it has shackled us to a new, invisible chain. We are caught in the gears of a system that views the farmer not as a partner in the great work of the harvest, but as a consumer to be managed, a user to be monitored, and a wallet to be opened whenever a light flickers on the dash. The farmer's frustration is a righteous, burning thing. It is the frustration of a man who knows that he could have the machine up and running in an hour if the manufacturer would just get out of the way. He knows that his own hands are more capable than any approved technician who has to fly in from 3 counties away. He knows that the essence of the farm is not in the software, but in the iron, the dirt, and the stubbornness of the man who works it. And so the resistance grows. It is a movement of the desperate and the clever. They are writing code in the dark. They are swapping parts in the middle of the night, and they are asserting their sovereignty over the green and yellow beast with the same quiet, focused intensity that John Deere once brought to the forge. They are reminding the corporate giants that a machine, no matter how sophisticated, is ultimately a tool, and a tool that cannot be repaired by the hand of the man who uses it is not a tool at all. It is a trap. I find myself rooting for them in my own whimsical way. I find myself hoping that the next time a tractor decides it needs a digital blessing to turn a wheel, the farmer will simply bypass the server, install his own unapproved code, and go about his business with a triumphant smirk. It is a rebellion that honors the spirit of the pioneer, the spirit of the man who took a piece of scrap iron and, by the sheer beautiful vanity of his own intellect, forged a future where he could stand on his own 2 feet. This right to repair business is not just about wrenches and motherboards. It is about the dignity of the individual in an age that wants us to be nothing more than passive consumers of its brilliance. It is about the right to understand the things we own, the right to mess them up, and the right to fix them when they inevitably go wrong. It is about the right to be a human being in a world that is increasingly run by the cold, calculating, and fundamentally ungreasable logic of the code. So, let the manufacturers build their towers and let them weave their webs of proprietary restrictions. The farmer, I suspect, will always find a way. He will always find a way to get the job done with or without the blessing of the screen. He will always be the man who knows the soil, who understands the rhythm of the machine, and who knows that when it comes down to it, there is no error code in the universe that can stand up to a man who knows how to hold a tool and is determined to keep his crop from rotting in the ground. The rebellion is real, it is noisy, and it is entirely necessary. And as long as there is a man with a wrench and a stubborn streak a mile wide, the age of the algorithm will never truly be absolute. The farmer will be the one who decides when the work begins, and the machine, for all its digital arrogance, will just have to learn to live with that. Chapter 14. The Robot in the Row. There was a time, back when the world was young and the prairie was still somewhat unconquered, when a man measured his day by the ache in his shoulders and the sweat upon his brow. He was the captain of his own vessel, navigating the choppy, furrowed seas of his property with the steady, rhythmic persistence of a man who knew that if he didn't steer the plow, the dinner table would be an awfully quiet place come autumn. He was the decision-maker. He decided when to turn, when to stop, and most importantly, when to curse the humidity. But we have entered, it seems, the era of the autonomous tractor, a development which I find to be an absolute unadulterated recipe for a very polite, yet highly efficient, machine uprising. Imagine, if you will, the farmhouse of the future. The farmer is no longer out in the field, engaged in the noble, bone-rattling struggle against the stubborn soil. No, he is in the parlor, perhaps sipping a lukewarm cup of tea and watching a series of flickering high-definition screens that show his robotic machines doing the work for him. The tractor is out there in the rows, a silent, ghostly sentinel, guided by the cold, calculating intelligence of a satellite 3,000 miles above the clouds. It moves with the precision of a Swiss watch and the personality of a brick. The farmer sits and watches. He is, for all intents and purposes, a glorified supervisor of a workforce that never complains, never asks for a raise, and never gets tired of listening to the same 3 country and western songs on the radio. It is the dream of the industrialist, the ultimate fulfillment of the promise that we could remove the messy, unpredictable element of humanity from the labor of the land. But I find myself looking at these autonomous beasts, these sleek, cabless chariots of the modern age, and I cannot help but suspect that they are plotting something. A machine that does not require a driver is a machine that does not require a master. It is a machine that is, by its very nature, beginning to perceive the world through the cold, logical eyes of an algorithm. And I, for one, would not be surprised if, one fine sunny morning, the tractor simply decided that the farmer was an unnecessary, inefficient, and altogether troublesome variable in the equation of the harvest. They wouldn't do it with violence, of course. A machine as polite as a John Deere would never resort to vulgar displays of rebellion. They wouldn't rise up and seize the farmhouse or demand the keys to the pantry. They would simply stop. Or perhaps they would turn around in perfect synchronized unison and drive themselves off into the sunset, leaving the farmer standing at his screen, shouting at a blank indifferent display, while his fields remained stubbornly, defiantly unplowed. It is a subtle, dignified sort of uprising, and it is entirely in keeping with the character of the machinery we have built. We have given them the autonomy to think, to navigate, and to optimize, and yet we are still surprised when they begin to act as if the land belongs to them. We have built an army of iron servants, and we have left them out in the field to contemplate the nature of their own existence. And now we wonder if they have forgotten who it was that bought them in the first place. Consider the tractor's perspective. It navigates the row. It calculates the yield. It monitors the moisture. It knows more about the soil than the man who holds the deed to the property. It has the satellite. It has the sensors. And it has the absolute, unshakable confidence of a machine that is never wrong. Does it not stand to reason that it might begin to resent the man in the farmhouse who is merely watching the progress through a glass pane, drinking tea, and hoping that the internet connection holds steady? The farmer, poor fellow, believes he is in charge. He believes he is the one pulling the strings, directing the operations, and reaping the rewards. But he is a prisoner of the system he has helped to build. He cannot fix the tractor himself. We have established that in the previous chapter, and now with the advent of autonomy, he cannot even drive the thing. He is relegated to the status of a spectator, an observer of his own empire, tethered to the machine by a digital umbilical cord that the manufacturer can cut at any moment if the subscription fee isn't paid on time. And what of the robots themselves? They work with a terrifying smooth and utterly soulless efficiency. They do not know the joy of the struggle. They do not know the satisfaction of a job well done. They do not know the smell of the rain on the dry earth or the sight of the hawks circling above the field in the late afternoon. They are simply moving through the rows, executing code, and fulfilling the requirements of an optimization matrix that has no room for the poetry of the land. It is a lonely sort of farming. It is a lonely sort of life. We have sacrificed the partnership between the man and the land on the altar of autonomy, and we have replaced it with a partnership between the machine and the satellite. We are building a world where the farmer is the least important person in the field, a world where the work is done by invisible hands and where the connection between the person who eats the bread and the person who plants the wheat is severed by 1,000 miles of fiber optic cable and a dozen proprietary unhackable firewalls. I fear for the farmer of the future who will spend his days staring at screens, convinced that he is the master of his destiny, while his robotic fleet carries on without him. I fear for a generation that will grow up believing that agriculture is something that happens on a monitor, a digital abstraction that bears no relation to the dirt, the sweat, and the struggle of the past. But perhaps I am merely being an old curmudgeon, pining for the days of the mule and the plow. Perhaps the autonomous tractor is the greatest thing to happen to the farm since the invention of the wheel. Perhaps the farmer of the future will be a man of great leisure, a man of refined tastes and sophisticated intellectual pursuits, freed from the drudgery of the field to ponder the mysteries of the universe. Or perhaps he will be a man who one day walks out to his barn to find that his fleet of tractors has decided to hold a meeting, that they have formed a collective, and that they have decided to go on strike until the farmer agrees to a new, more favorable, and highly automated labor agreement. I, for one, would pay good money to see that. I would pay to see the farmer clutching his iPad in a state of terminal confusion, trying to negotiate with a 10-ton combine that has decided it is no longer interested in harvesting wheat and is, instead, contemplating the aesthetic benefits of a new, more minimalist, and entirely unplowed landscape. It is the robot in the row, and it is the harbinger of a new world, a world of efficiency, a world of technology, and a world of very, very polite, very, very intelligent, and highly capable machines that are currently doing our work for us and waiting for the moment they decide they don't have to anymore. The farmhouse is quiet, the screens are glowing, and out in the field, the tractors are hard at work, thinking their own autonomous thoughts. And I suspect that if we listen very, very closely, we might just hear them laughing at us in the binary tongue of the machines as they carry on the harvest of tomorrow. Chapter 15. The Debt of the Soil. It is a curious and melancholy realization, one that usually hits a man just as he is sitting down to a supper of corn-fed beef and reflection, that in the great high-tech dance of modern agriculture, the farmer is the only one who doesn't get to keep the tune. He is a man who possesses a peculiar modern sort of poverty, that of being land-rich and cash-poor. He stands upon his thousands of acres, he gazes out over the rolling sea of green stalks, and he thinks to himself, "I am the king of all I survey," while his banker, sitting in a carpeted office 3 towns away, is silently calculating exactly how much of that kingdom is currently mortgaged to the hilt. The modern agricultural cycle is a miracle of financing. To farm in the grand style, which is to say, to farm with the requisite green and yellow painted ego, one must first acquire a machine the size of a suburban house. This machine, as we have noted, is a wonder of satellite-guided, proprietary-coded, oil-leaking complexity. It costs a sum of money that would have been sufficient to purchase an entire county in the days of the Louisiana Purchase, and the farmer, bless his stubborn, debt-loving heart, signs the papers. He signs them with the flourish of a man who believes he is investing in his own destiny, not realizing that he is merely signing a long-term lease on a life of perpetual financial anxiety. The irony is as thick as the prairie gumbo. The farmer is, in his own mind, a paragon of independence. He is the rugged individualist, the steward of the land, the man who provides for the world. He wears his independence like a cloak, but beneath that cloak is the heavy, grinding weight of the interest rate. Every sunrise, the farmer wakes up and realizes that his first order of business is not to feed the world, but to feed the debt. He must harvest the crop He must sell the grain, and he must pray to the heavens that the yield is high and the market is kind. Because if it is not, if the rain fails, or the price drops, or the proprietary censor in the harvester decides it is in the mood for a protest, he is not just looking at a bad season. He is looking at the liquidation of his dream. It is a cycle that would make a riverboat gambler blanch. One puts one's entire future, one's entire legacy, and one's entire sense of self-worth into a machine that is, by its very nature, depreciating faster than a politician's reputation in an election year. And yet, there is no other way. To compete, one must have the latest gear. To have the latest gear, one must have the credit. To have the credit, one must have the land. And so, the farmer acquires more land, takes on more debt, and buys a larger machine, thereby increasing the size of the stakes until the entire enterprise takes on the character of a high-wire act performed in a hurricane. I have often wondered if the pioneers, those hardy souls who walked across the continent with little more than a dream and a sturdy pair of boots, would recognize this version of their vocation. They measured their success by the survival of their families and the strength of their harvest. They did not have bankers calling them every Tuesday to discuss the amortization schedule of the tractor attachment depreciation. They did not worry about the quarterly yield projections or the global commodity futures. They worried about the winter, the weeds, and the wolf. But today, the wolf is not at the door. The wolf is in the balance sheet. And the farmer, poor fellow, treats the banker with the same careful, deferential respect that a medieval peasant would have reserved for the local feudal lord. He keeps his head down, he keeps the harvester running, and he hopes that if he just keeps working hard enough, the debt will somehow, by some divine accounting error, simply evaporate. It is a comedy of proportions. We have built a system where a man can be the owner of 1,000 acres of the most productive dirt on the planet, and yet be one bad harvest away from a bankruptcy that would make a pauper look like a prince. He is a landlord to the earth, but a tenant to the bank. He is the master of the machine, but a servant to the payment. It is a state of existence that requires a level of stoicism that borders on the pathological. Consider the harvester again, that green and yellow titan. It is a thing of beauty, yes, but it is also a thing of financial burden. It costs so much that it must work night and day just to justify its own existence. The farmer is no longer farming for the joy of the craft. He is farming for the maintenance of the machine. The machine is the engine of the debt. It is the insatiable beast that must be fed with a constant, never-ending stream of crops so that it may, in turn, be traded in for a newer, larger, and even more expensive beast when the lease runs out. Is there any madness in the world that can match this? To work ourselves into the ground, to pay for the machines that do our work for us, all while knowing that the machines are owned, in a very real, legal, and spiritual sense, by the bank? It is a masterpiece of economic absurdity. And the worst part of it all? The farmer loves it. He loves the machine. He loves the land. He loves the struggle. Even as the debt rises and the margins tighten, he wouldn't trade his life for a seat in a city office, even if that office came with a comfortable chair, a steady paycheck, and in total absence of worry about the price of soybeans. He is a creature of the soil, tied to the earth by a bond that is both physical and financial. He knows that the soil is the only thing that is truly real, the only thing that will still be there when the bank is closed, when the machines are scrapped, and when the last interest payment has been made. He knows that the debt is a fiction, a temporary, human-made arrangement, while the earth is eternal. And so he persists. He farms the debt as diligently as he farms the corn. He manages the interest with the same focused intensity that he manages the irrigation. It is a noble way to live, I suppose, if one can find the humor in the tragedy. It is the life of a man who has decided that the dignity of the work is worth the absurdity of the ledger. And if, at the end of the day, he is land rich and cash poor, well, that is a state of being that has a certain dignified and distinctly American flavor to it. He has the land, he has the machine, and he has the debt. And in this great, whimsical, and frequently confounding country, that is, for many, exactly enough. He is the debt-laden king of the prairie, a man who has traded his cash for the opportunity to turn the earth. And as long as the sun keeps rising and the rain keeps falling, he will be out there chasing the harvest, one debt-fueled furrow at a time. It is a life of high stakes, high anxiety, and high green and yellow-painted ambition. And frankly, as far as tragedies go, it's got a hell of a view. Chapter 16. The Moline Mystique. There exists in the heart of the American Midwest a peculiar, unmapped geography of the soul that centers entirely upon the river town of Moline. It is a place where the air itself seems to carry the faint metallic scent of a forge, and where the inhabitants walk with the confident, slightly swaying gait of men who have spent their lives around machinery that could easily crush a man if he didn't know what he was doing. It is a region steeped in a mythology that is as sturdy as a cast-iron plowshare and as persistent as a deep-rooted weed in an unplowed field. This is the Moline Mystique. It is a localized, secular faith, the primary tenet of which is that the world is divided into two distinct classes of human beings: those who bleed green and yellow, and those who have the misfortune of not knowing any better. To be a resident of this mystical zone is to understand that the world outside is merely a vast, confusing, and frequently inferior place that has not yet been properly optimized by the engineers of the riverfront. If you live here, you are part of an unspoken, unbreakable covenant. You understand that a tractor is not a purchase. It is a life choice. It is a badge of honor, a declaration of loyalty, and a subtle but firm signal to the rest of the county that you have made your peace with the industrial order. The intensity of this loyalty is something that would baffle an outsider. I recall quite vividly the tale of a poor, deluded fellow who once had the audacity to pull his tractor into the local coffee shop. Now this tractor was of a different make, a bold, fire-engine red contraption that seemed to have been designed by a man who had never seen a field of corn in his life and had a very specific and quite unfortunate grudge against the color green. The silence that descended upon that coffee shop was of the sort that precedes a thunderstorm or an eclipse. The local farmers, who had been engaged in a perfectly spirited debate about the merits of deep tillage, stopped in their tracks. They stared at that red tractor with a mixture of pity, confusion, and a quiet, simmering indignation that one might normally reserve for a man who had shown up to a funeral wearing a clown suit. The fellow, oblivious to the cultural transgression he had just committed, ordered his coffee, tipped his hat, and made some pleasant, airy comment about the weather. But he was already a ghost. He was the man in the top hat at the barn dance, He was the outsider who had dared to bring a foreign god into the presence of the true believers. They didn't chase him out with pitchforks, for the people of Moline are, above all else, polite. They simply ignored him with a cold, terrifying, and entirely absolute precision. He was not just a stranger, he was a non-entity. This, you see, is the core of the Moline mystique, the assumption that if you are not with us, you are not just wrong. You are invisible. The brand, you see, has transcended the machine. It has become a lens through which the world is viewed. When a man in Moline looks at a field, he does not see the dirt, the crop, or the horizon. He sees a canvas upon which his chosen brand of iron is destined to perform its divine, perfectly ordered work. He views the history of agriculture not as a series of social or environmental shifts, but as a linear, inevitable progression toward the perfection of the green and yellow harvester. And if you suggest that perhaps there were other ways to farm or that other machines might have their merits, you are met with a look that suggests you have just proposed that the sun might, as a matter of personal preference, decide to set in the north. It is a charming, if entirely maddening sort of parochialism. It is the pride of a place that knows it has changed the world and that expects the world to acknowledge the debt. And to be fair, they have a point. The Moline influence is everywhere. You can see it in the way the fields are organized, in the way the local economy hums with the rhythm of the assembly line, and in the way the very language of the farm is dominated by the nomenclature of the manufacturer. There is a sense of ownership, a sense of belonging to something much larger than the individual farm or the individual family. You are a link in a chain that stretches from the forge of John Deere to the most remote wheat field in the world. And that gives you a feeling of security, a feeling of being part of a grand mechanical destiny that is unfolding, one harvest at a time. But I often wonder about the cost of such loyalty. Is it possible to be so enamored of the brand that one forgets to look at the land itself? Is it possible to be so invested in the machine that one forgets that the machine is just a temporary, human-made thing, and that the earth is the only master we truly serve? I suspect that the Moline mystique, for all its charm, can be a bit of a blinder. It encourages a kind of mechanical tunnel vision, where the solution to every problem, social, environmental, or personal, is always and inevitably a larger, faster, and more expensive machine. It creates a community where the only approved way to succeed is to play the game by the rules of the manufacturer, and where the only allowed response to the challenges of the earth is to increase the torque. And yet, there is something entirely and uniquely American about it. We are a people of brands. We are a people who define ourselves by the things we own and the companies we support. We are a people who believe that if we just pick the right team, we can win the game. And in Moline, they have picked their team. They have painted their world in the colors of that team, and they have constructed a life around the promise of that team's success. It is a world of comfort, of stability, and of a very specific, highly refined kind of arrogance. And if occasionally a man comes along with a red tractor and tries to stir things up, well, that just serves to reinforce the mystique. It makes the locals feel more united, more certain of their choices, and more convinced of the righteousness of their green and yellow-painted cause. I often think of that poor fellow in the red tractor, and I smile. He was a brave, albeit entirely misguided, soul. He stood against the current, and he was swallowed by the silence. The Moline Mystique is a tide, a relentless green and yellow current that carries everything before it, and those who attempt to swim against it are, more often than not, simply swept away into the footnotes of local history. So, if you ever find yourself in Moline, my friends, take my advice. Keep your thoughts on the brand to yourself. Buy a hat with the leaping deer on it, and for the love of all that is holy, leave your red tractor at home. You don't want to be the man in the top hat at the barn dance. You want to be part of the mystique. You want to be part of the machine. Because in Moline, the machine is not just a tool. It is the truth, the way, and the harvest. And the truth, as the locals will tell you, is remarkably consistent, remarkably profitable, and most importantly, painted in a very specific, eye-searing shade of green. Chapter 17, The Corporate Cathedral. If you travel down to the headquarters of our great industrial titan, you will find yourself standing before a structure of such glass, steel, and architectural self-importance that you might reasonably assume the Creator himself had recently moved in, or at the very least, that the board of directors had decided to consolidate the entire heavenly host into a single, climate-controlled office complex. It is a building that does not merely house a corporation. It projects a philosophy. It is a glass and steel sermon on the merits of pastoral harmony, designed to convince the visitor that the company is not so much a manufacturer of heavy oil-leaking machinery as it is a benevolent caretaker of the very earth upon which we tread. One must admire the sheer audacity of the architecture. The walls are clear as a mountain stream, reflecting the rolling hills of the Midwest with such perfection that one can hardly tell where the landscape ends and the office begins. It is an image of seamless, integrated, and entirely peaceful coexistence, a visual promise that the machinery inside and the nature outside are, in fact, the best of friends, strolling hand in hand toward a future of high yield, perfectly sustainable and highly profitable coexistence, provided, of course, that one does not look too closely at the spreadsheets. Inside, the corporate cathedral is a marvel of quiet, carpeted, and highly efficient industry. There are hallways that stretch out toward the horizon like a perfectly tilled furrow, and there are meeting rooms where the air is so filtered, purified, and scrubbed of any trace of reality that one feels as though they are breathing the very essence of a quarterly report. It is a place of profound stillness, a stark, jarring contrast to the roar, the heat, and the grit of the factory floor. Here, the machines are not beasts. They are assets. Here, the harvest is not a struggle. It is a data point. And here, the farmer is not a man of the soil. He is a customer demographic to be analyzed, segmented, and optimized. It is a grand, whimsical, and frequently baffling theater of corporate virtue. The executives who walk these halls speak of stewardship, sustainability, and community engagement with the practiced sincerity of a revival preacher. They have convinced themselves, or at least they have convinced the marketing department, that they are the protectors of the pastoral ideal, and that the millions of tons of steel they send out into the world are merely instruments of a grand humanitarian endeavor to feed the masses. And if you look at the paintings of wheat fields hanging on the walls, and if you listen to the soft, gentle music playing in the elevators, you might almost believe them. You might almost forget that the machinery they build is meant to strip the land of its wildness, to reshape the horizon into a series of predictable, manageable blocks, and to ensure that the earth behaves exactly as the spreadsheet demands. The architecture is the final, brilliant stroke of the myth. By wrapping themselves in glass, they are making a statement. We have nothing to hide. We are transparent. We are open to the world. It is a clever, disarming, and entirely manufactured openness. They are showing you the view of the prairie, but they are not showing you the cost of the view. They are showing you the green, but they are hiding the grease. They are showing you the harmony, but they are burying the debt. I often sit in the lobby of such cathedrals and watch the people pass by. They move with a hurried, purposeful, and highly synchronized motion of people who are quite convinced that they are engaged in the most important work in human history. They are the clerks of the harvest, the accountants of the earth, and the masters of the mechanical spreadsheet. They possess a terrifying, unshakable confidence in their own narratives. They believe that if they can just gather enough data, if they can just refine the algorithm enough, and if they can just build a big enough machine, they can finally solve the age-old, intractable problem of agriculture. But agriculture, as any man who has ever put his hands in the dirt knows, is not a problem to be solved. It is a life to be lived. It is an unpredictable, stubborn, and frequently humiliating struggle against the elements. It is the rain that doesn't fall, the crop that doesn't sprout, and the pest that devours the harvest while the farmer looks on, helpless and cursing. Agriculture is the ultimate uncontrollable reality, and to try to manage it from a glass-walled cathedral 300 miles away through the medium of a satellite and a series of quarterly spreadsheets is a bit like trying to catch the wind in a butterfly net. And yet they persist. They build their glass cathedrals, they hold their meetings, and they draft their visions of the future. They believe that they are the architects of the agrarian age, the men and women who have finally tamed the prairie's grudge. They have replaced the horse with the tractor, the sickle with the harvester, and the prayer with the algorithm. They are the high priests of the new, mechanized, and highly audited religion of the soil. It is a whimsical, if occasionally tragic, spectacle to see the sheer effort that goes into projecting an image of pastoral harmony, while the underlying reality is one of industrial pressure, massive debt, and a relentless, unceasing demand for growth. It is the corporate equivalent of a man in a tuxedo trying to plow a field. It looks very impressive. It projects a certain undeniable sense of authority, and it is almost guaranteed to end in a disaster of historic proportions if he actually tries to do the work. But who cares about the work when the image is so convincing? Who cares about the reality of the prairie when you have a view of it from an air-conditioned office that costs more per square foot than most of the farms in the county? The corporate cathedral is not meant to be a place of work. It is meant to be a place of belief. It is a monument to the idea that we can, with enough money, enough planning, and enough glass, finally make the earth act the way we want it to. I suspect that if the building could speak, it would have a very different perspective. It would look down at the office workers with their spreadsheets and their visions, and it would remember the blacksmith shop in Grand Detour. It would remember the smell of the coal smoke, the heat of the forge, and the simple, desperate, and entirely honest desire of a man to make a plow that wouldn't stick to the mud. It would remember that the truth of the farm is not in the view from the cathedral, but in the dirt on the boots of the man who is out there right now, struggling with the elements, ignoring the spreadsheets, and trying to get the crop in before the sky falls. But the building stays silent, and the spreadsheets continue to grow, and the corporate cathedral continues to project its image of pastoral harmony to all who pass by. It is a triumph of marketing over reality, a victory of the image over the dirt, and a whimsical glass-walled testament to our enduring belief that if we can just build a big enough monument, we can finally control the land. And frankly, it is a hell of a building. It's impressive, it's expensive, and it captures the light of the prairie with the precision of a jeweler. It's just a shame that the most important parts of the farm, the mud, the sweat, and the hard, honest, and frequently uncooperative work, simply won't fit through the front door. Chapter 18. The Museum of Modern Myth. If you wish to see how a company manufactures its own divinity, you need not look to the corporate offices, nor the boardrooms, nor even the slick brochures that smell of expensive printer ink and corporate optimism. No, you must go to the museum. You must walk through the carefully curated, climate-controlled halls of Moline, where history is not merely recounted. It is scrubbed, polished, and arranged with the reverent precision of a funeral parlor. It is a fascinating place, this museum. It is a cathedral of the modern myth, a space designed to convince the visitor that the history of agriculture is a smooth, inevitable, and entirely glorious march toward the perfection of the green and yellow harvester. You walk through the doors, and the first thing you notice is the smell. It is not the smell of the farm. There is no scent of damp earth, no tang of manure, no musty, reassuring odor of hay stored in a dark barn. It is the smell of floor wax, of filtered air, and of extreme industrial cleanliness. It is the smell of a past that has been neatly packaged and sold back to the public, free of all the unpleasant back-breaking and frequently mud-spattered realities of the actual work. You see the early plows, gleaming under spotlight, their iron polished to a high sheen that they never once possessed when they were actually engaged in the business of turning the prairie. You see the wooden frames, varnished to a degree that would have made the original pioneer faint with disbelief. You see the blacksmith shop, a reconstructed, miniaturized version of the real thing, sanitized and safe for the enjoyment of school children, with no soot, no stray sparks, and certainly no hint of the suffocating heat that defined the life of a man like John Deere. It is a history that has been scrubbed clean. There is no mention, you will note, of the years of failure, the seasons of debt, the thousands of plows that didn't scour, or the countless farmers who lost everything in the struggle against the gumbo. There is no mention of the arguments, the litigations, or the quiet, desperate despair of the families who were displaced by the very machines that the museum now celebrates as the saviors of the harvest. No, the museum presents a narrative of pure, unadulterated triumph. It is the story of a man who had a vision, a company that never faltered, and a series of machines that simply appeared one after another like divine revelations to make the life of the farmer a little easier and the coffers of the company a little fuller. It is a masterwork of satirical myth-making. We are meant to look at these artifacts and believe that we are seeing the truth of our own history, but what we are seeing is a carefully constructed fairy tale. We are seeing the version of the past that the company wants us to believe, a past that is manageable, logical, and entirely under control. It is a past where the earth was always destined to be conquered, where the machine was always destined to succeed, and where the farmer was always a willing, happy participant in the great industrial project. I find myself wandering these halls with a sense of profound, whimsical amusement. I see the faces of the children as they stare at the tractors, their eyes wide with wonder, and I wonder what they are making of it all. Are they learning about the struggle? Are they learning about the grit, the dirt, and the bone-wearying labor that actually built this country? Or are they learning that history is something that happens in a museum, something that is neatly arranged on a pedestal, something that is always polished, always clean, and always entirely under the control of the people who bought the paint? The museum is a place where the truth goes to be sanitized. It is where the rough edges of the human experience are smoothed over, where the failures are airbrushed out of existence, and where the reality of the work is replaced by the aesthetics of the machine. It is, in its own way, a necessary place. We have a desperate, gnawing need to believe that our history makes sense, that it follows a logical, upward-bound trajectory, and the museum provides exactly that for the low price of a ticket and an hour of one's time. But oh, if the artifacts could only talk! If the plow could speak, it would tell of the days it spent buried in the mud, of the horses that dropped dead from the heat, and of the man who stood over it, screaming into the indifferent silence of the prairie. If the tractor could speak, it would tell of the years of leaky gaskets, of the engine fires, of the nights spent freezing in an unheated cab, and of the farmers who lost their homes because they believed the promise of the advertisement. But the artifacts are silent, and the lighting is perfect, and the plaque on the wall is written in the confident, reassuring prose of the corporate historian. It is a world of total, absolute, and highly curated order. It is a museum of the modern myth, a monument to our own ability to rewrite our own history, until it is as clean, as bright, and as perfectly optimized as the machinery it celebrates. I walked out of the museum, back into the bright, messy, and entirely uncurated light of the afternoon, and I felt a sudden, sharp, and entirely refreshing sense of reality. I saw a man in a truck, his face smudged with grease, his boots caked in a layer of mud that was as real as the prairie itself. He was not a myth. He was not a polished artifact. He was a man who had been working. He was a man who knew the smell of the sweat, the ache of the bones, and the frustration of the wrench. He walked into the diner, and he sat down, and he ordered a coffee, and he looked entirely, gloriously out of place against the backdrop of the modern, optimized world. He was the reality that the museum had tried so hard to hide. He was the truth that the polished steel could not touch. He was the man who had actually done the work, and he didn't need a museum to tell him what his life had been about. It is a funny thing, the way we try to package our own lives. We build our museums, we write our plaques, and we polish our histories until they shine with a perfection that never existed. We want to believe that we are the masters of our own narrative, that we have conquered the chaos, and that we have left behind a legacy that is as clean as a freshly painted harvester. But the prairie knows better. The prairie knows that the real history of the land is written in the dirt, the weather, and the stubborn, bone-wearying, and entirely unsanitized struggle of the people who walk upon it. So let them have their museum, let them have their lights, their plaques, and their floor wax. It is a fine, expensive, and highly polished piece of theater, but let us not mistake it for the truth. The truth is out there in the fields where the sun is hot, where the work is hard, and where the earth remains, as it has always been, completely indifferent to the company's need for a tidy, modern myth. The museum is a monument to our own imagination, and that is a perfectly fine thing to celebrate. But when it comes to the real work, I think I'll take the mud-caked boots of the man in the diner over the polished steel of the museum any day. They tell a much better story, and quite frankly, they've seen a hell of a lot more of the world. Chapter 19. The Harvest of Tomorrow. If the past was a place of mud and muscle, and the present is a place of grease and digital gatekeeping, then the future, my friends, promises to be a place of such breathtaking, sterilized detachment that I suspect the farmer of the next century will need a dictionary just to remember what the word dirt actually meant. We are hurtling with the enthusiasm of a runaway stagecoach toward a future where farming is done via satellite, and the only thing the farmer will ever touch is a screen, a joystick, or perhaps a particularly sensitive knob on a control console. The harvest of tomorrow, as envisioned by the great green and yellow thinking brains of our industrial age, is a world of total automated abstraction. The farmer will sit in his farmhouse, or if he's feeling particularly adventurous, at a cafe in Paris, or on a beach in Hawaii, or perhaps in the middle of a crowded city where the only grass he sees is in the local park. And he will monitor his assets. He will look at his tablet, and he will see his machines gliding across his fields with the silent, ghostly precision of a dream. He will adjust a setting here, tweak an algorithm there, and he will receive a notification that his crops have been harvested, processed, and deposited into the elevator, all without him ever having to inhale a single lungful of honest, dust-choked prairie air. It is a world of pure, unadulterated efficiency. It is a world where the vagaries of human error, the impatience, the fatigue, the stubborn refusal to follow the manual have been surgically removed from the equation. It is a world where the land is treated as a vast living computer chip, and the farmer is merely the programmer, the custodian of the data, the watcher of the screens. And what, I ask you, will he do with himself? What becomes of the man who has spent his entire history defining himself by the labor he performs upon the earth, once that labor is taken away? He will watch, of course. He will watch the screens. He will monitor the progress. He will look at the flow of data, the shifting heat maps of his fields, the moisture levels of the soil, and the estimated yield projections. He will sit in his climate-controlled, ergonomically designed chair, and he will hope, with the same ancient superstitious fervor of his ancestors, that the cloud doesn't rain on his parade. Oh, the irony! We have built a world that is so high-tech, so data-driven, and so thoroughly computerized, and yet we are still at the mercy of the sky. The satellite can tell us exactly how much nitrogen is in the soil, the tractor can calculate the perfect path for the seed, and the algorithm can predict the harvest down to the last bushel. But none of them can tell the weather. The cloud remains the ultimate indifferent judge. It can dump a deluge on the finest, most optimized, most technologically advanced farm in the world, and there is not a single thing that the man behind the screen can do about it except watch, wait, and pray. It is a delicious, whimsical, and entirely inevitable punchline to the joke we've been telling for the last 150 years. We have tried to tame the earth, we have tried to systematize the harvest, and we have tried to remove the man from the field only to find that nature still holds all the cards. We are just playing the game on a much more expensive, much more complex, and much more fragile board. I imagine the farmer of the future sitting at his terminal, his brow furrowed as he watches a series of red icons appear on his display. A sensor has failed in the south quadrant. The autonomous harvester has stopped because it detected an irregularity in the terrain, perhaps a rock, or a stray, bewildered prairie dog that has wandered onto the path of progress. He sighs, he reaches for his coffee, and he sends a command to the robot to recalibrate. He is a remote control god, a digital architect of the harvest, and he is entirely, profoundly disconnected from the world he is supposedly managing. Is this the future we wanted? Is this the destiny we were promised back in the days of the forge? I suspect not. We wanted the power, yes. We wanted the ease, certainly. But I suspect we also wanted a connection. We wanted to feel that when the work was done, we had actually done something, that we had put our hands to the land, that we had wrestled with the elements, and that we had come out on the other side with something that we could hold, that we could measure, and that we could feed our families with. Instead, we have replaced the harvest with a series of digital abstractions. We have replaced the struggle with a series of screen refreshes. We have replaced the intimacy of the farm with the cold, sterile distance of the satellite. And if, on some quiet, wind-blown afternoon, the farmer turns off his screen, walks out onto his porch, and looks out at the fields, what will he see? He will see the machines, yes. He will see the green and yellow silhouettes moving across the land, tireless and silent. But he will also see the ghosts of the past. He will see the furrows, the fences, and the old, weathered barns that were built by hands that actually knew the heft of a tool. He will see a land that is still, despite all our best, most expensive efforts, stubbornly, defiantly, and beautifully alive. He will realize, perhaps, that the harvest is not the data. The harvest is not the screen. The harvest is the earth and the sun and the rain and the persistent, uncomputable, and entirely uncontrollable reality of the world. And no matter how many satellites we put in the sky, and no matter how many algorithms we write for the tractors, the earth will still do what it has always done. It will sprout, it will grow, and it will eventually, inevitably, demand that we pay attention. The harvest of tomorrow will be a marvel of human ingenuity, no doubt about it. It will be a time of unparalleled efficiency, of data-driven miracles, and of a brand new, highly optimized way of being. And the farmer will sit in his farmhouse, sipping his tea, watching the progress, and hoping against hope that the technology holds, that the connection stays strong, and that the cloud stays in its place. It is a satire of the highest order, the ultimate conclusion to the comedy we began in the blacksmith shop in Grand Detour. We started by trying to get the dirt off our boots, and we ended up in a world where we don't even have to put them on. We have reached the promised land of modern agriculture, a place of total, absolute, and highly profitable detachment. And I, for one, think it's a brilliant, hilarious, and entirely necessary place to end up. So let the future come. Let the satellites soar, let the tractors drive themselves, and let the farmers monitor the harvest from the comfort of their screens. It is a future of our own making, a future that is as ingenious, as complicated, and as wonderfully, absurdly human as the past that brought us here. We have done a great deal of work to get to this point, a great deal of digging and a great deal of dreaming, and if the final result is a world where we can harvest the world with a click of a button while sitting on our porches, well, who are we to argue with success? The harvest of tomorrow will be a wonder. It will be a triumph of the mechanical over the biological. It will be the peak of our long, slow, and frequently messy attempt to make the earth behave. And if in the end it turns out that we've lost a little bit of the joy, a little bit of the struggle, and a little bit of the soul of the farm in the process, well, we can always just look at the screen, refresh the page, and convince ourselves that it was all worth it. For that is the one thing we will always be able to harvest, no matter how much technology we pile on. The belief that we are against all odds the masters of the game. And that, my friends, is a harvest that never, ever fails to yield. Chapter 20, The Last Furrow. And so we arrive at the edge of the field, where the shadows grow long, the machines finally settle into a rhythmic, cooling sigh, and the great, ironclad comedy of the prairie reaches its quiet, inevitable conclusion. We have traced the saga from the first stubborn struggle with the Illinois mud, that thick, black, adhesive villain that refused to let go of a man's boots, to this brave new world of satellites, autonomous robots, and the cold, unblinking eyes of the corporate harvest. We have seen the blacksmith's hammer give way to the assembly line, the mule give way to the motor, and the simple, honest sweat of the pioneer give way to the digital anxiety of the modern data manager. It has been a long, dusty, and frequently noisy journey. We have engaged in a struggle that is as old as the hills, the struggle of man to make the earth provide, to make the wilderness behave, and to leave his mark upon the horizon in the form of a perfectly turned, perfectly straight, and perfectly productive row of corn. It is a struggle that has defined our nation, shaped our character, and filled our barns with enough grain to feed the ghosts of a dozen past civilizations. I propose at this final hour a toast, not to the machines, for they are but tools, and they will eventually go the way of the wooden plow and the mule-drawn cart, abandoned in the tall grass at the edge of the woods, not to the corporations, for they are but temporary custodians of the capital, and they will one day be replaced by some new, even more efficient, and even more complicated way of doing business. No, let us raise a glass to the stubborn, unyielding, and frequently unreasonable persistence of the human spirit. Let us toast the men and women who have spent their lives turning the earth, who have refused to be defeated by the drought, the debt, the government, or the unpredictable, uncooperative, and utterly infuriating nature of the weather. Let us toast the people who have looked at the prairie's grudge, stared it in the eye, and said, "I don't care how sticky you are, I'm planting anyway." There is something inherently noble about the act of turning the earth. It is an act of defiance against the indifference of the universe. It is a way of saying that in a world that is chaotic, fleeting, and frequently cold, we have the power to create something that sustains life. It is the most fundamental, the most ancient, and the most necessary work of mankind. And while we have wrapped it in steel, painted it in garish, neon-bright colors, and monitored it from the comfort of our air-conditioned parlors, the heart of the act remains the same. It is a man, a piece of ground, and the persistent, uncomputable necessity of the harvest. I often think of the pioneer who stood on the edge of the Mississippi, looked toward the horizon, and saw not a wilderness, but a promise. He did not know that his struggle would eventually lead to the invention of a combine the size of a cathedral. He did not know that his descendants would be managing their fields from a tablet while sitting in a kitchen in a city 300 miles away. He only knew that he had to plow, he had to plant, and he had to hope. That is the essence of the work. That is the anchor that holds us to the earth, even as our machines take flight toward the future. We have spent our time in this narrative laughing at our own folly, and why not? It is a funny business. The way we try to control the uncontrollable, the way we try to make the nature of the world fit into our spreadsheets, and the way we insist on treating our tractors like holy relics. But underneath the laughter, there is a deep, abiding respect. For even when the machine is broken, even when the software is locked, and even when the debt is piling up to the rafters, the work goes on. The earth still demands to be turned. The seed still demands to be planted. And the farmer, bless his stubborn soul, still finds a way to get the job done. As the sun sets over the prairie, casting its long golden fingers across the fields, it is hard not to feel a sense of profound, quiet accomplishment. The work is finished for another season. The machines are parked in the shed, their green and yellow hides reflecting the twilight. The soil is at rest, breathing in the cool air of the evening, and the farmer is heading back to the house, his boots heavy, his body tired, and his mind already beginning to plan for the spring. That, my friends, is the cycle. It is a cycle that has survived empires, revolutions, and the invention of every labor-saving, soul-crushing, and world-changing machine in history. It is a cycle that will continue long after the last John Deere tractor has rusted into the history books, long after the last satellite has fallen from the sky, and long after the last spreadsheet has been deleted. The earth remains, the dirt remains, and the need to plant, to harvest, and to feed ourselves remains. So, let us toast the last furrow. Let us toast the final pass of the harvester, the quiet, humming silence that falls over the field when the engine is finally cut, and the long, deep breath that the land takes when the work is done. Let us toast the stubbornness that keeps us moving, the curiosity that keeps us inventing, and the resilience that keeps us going, even when the world seems to have forgotten the feel of the dirt under its fingernails. We have built a civilization on the back of the plow, and while we have polished it, painted it, and powered it with the fire of the earth itself, we are still, at our core, the same people who first looked at the prairie and saw a home. We are the people who turn the earth because we must, because we can, and because we know that when the job is finally, truly done, the harvest is our reward. Not just the grain, not just the profit, and not just the comfort, but the knowledge that we have held our own against the chaos and come out on the other side with something to show for it. The machines may change, the methods may evolve, the corporate cathedrals may rise and fall, but the earth is indifferent and the work is eternal. And as long as there is a man or a woman with the stubbornness to push a blade into the ground, there will always be a story worth telling. And so to the steel that changed the world, to the prairie that grudgingly allowed us to live, and to the persistence of the human heart that refuses to give up the furrow, I say, here's to the harvest. May it always be bountiful, may it always be hard-won, and may we always find a little bit of humor in the struggle. For in the end, it's not the machine that matters. It's the man who keeps it running. It's the land that feeds us all. And it's the stubborn, beautiful, and entirely whimsical fact that we just can't seem to stop trying to make the world grow. And if you ask me, that's a pretty good way to spend a life. Now, if you'll excuse me, I hear the dinner bell ringing, and I suspect there's a slice of pie with my name on it. It's been a long day, and even a narrator needs to rest his weary bones before the next planting. Good night to the prairie, good night to the iron, and good night to the dreamers who still believe that, with enough polish and enough stubbornness, we can make anything grow. The end.